My name is Ralph Simon. I'm the host of Future Talks. Future Talks is a specific look at what the future is going to bring. And this is a series developed by two of the world's leading futurists, Gerd Leonhard, who's based in Europe, and Glenn Heemstra from the United States, both of whom have specialized over the past many years in trying to understand and unravel the future such that we can understand it today. So I'd like to introduce Gerd Leonhard. Gerd, welcome to Future Talk.
Thank you.
Gerd, you wrote a book that has become a seminal piece of work over the last 2.5 years, where you looked at the future of music. And the book that you wrote is in fact called The Future of Music. Give us some background as to why you wrote the book and what some of your findings were and how this has changed the perception of the professionals in the media industry.
Well, I wrote the book together with a good friend of mine from Berklee College, Dave Cusack.
That's the Berklee School of Music.
Yes, in Boston, and they're also the publisher. And basically the book was born out of our experience of 95 through 2002, of the huge changes that came because of the internet and the music business. So the concept of artists going direct, of promoting themselves, of having tools of distribution, of being able to be rated online, meet people online, all these things that came forth. And then of course the internet bubble crashed, which basically, like any sort of gold rush type thing, it has to crash first before you have a real business.
Right.
So it crashed, and out of that, the whole experience was that we had put together actually ended up in this book. And we took stuff that we thought was definitive in terms of trends and momentum, one of them being the idea of music like water, the idea of a utility, which we're in fact seeing today, right? I mean,
give us an example of how you think it's become a utility, and why do you say it's like water? People still have to pay for music, or do they not?
Well, they pay for water too, right? I mean, it's an interesting angle. It's like people get a little bit worried about this at music as being a commodity, which that word really wouldn't fit here. I think that ultimately, if you look at what's happening in water, is that every single person pays for water, and we actually pay quite a bit.
Right.
And then we go out and we buy bottled water to drink,
right,
which is currently a $100 billion business, right? Growing at 17% per year. I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? So
this is about 3 times bigger than the global music industry.
Yes, it is, and the concept is very much the same. I go to the tap here, I drink, I don't have to put my credit card in, right? But I do pay for water at home. If I water the lawn every day, I pay more. So very much the same system is going to be in place for media, especially for music, given that I'm going to have sort of a throughput device, which is digital networks, where I get the music for what feels like free, but it's not actually free.
So let's take a look. The traditional pattern was, if you were a musician, an artist, a songwriter, a composer, a creator, and of course today music is also visual, the MTV revolution 30 years ago. So if one is developing the new future of music, where the traditional pattern was that a record label would sign an artist, develop the talent, spend a lot of money in the development of the artist's craft, how is the future going to change this, and what is fundamentally different? I understand that the internet has changed things, but give us some examples of how the consumer face or the consumer-facing linkage works.
Well, I think that we can take several already existing models like cable TV or like cell phone subscriptions, right, to where the user essentially pays, but they regard this as almost free. It used to be you pay $10 a month for cable in the beginnings.
Right.
That was after they were sued for years to not even be able to do it, right?
Right.
And now the average amount that the US subscriber is paying is $72 a month for cable.
Right.
And most people perceive that as free in parentheses, right? Because they have it and they just got used to it. In Europe, we pay $200 a year to even be allowed to have a television, right? Which would never fly in the US, of course.
Right.
So the concept of making a payment is accepted as long as sort of wrapped up and the value is clear. If you watch cable TV, you can have 150 people sitting in your living room, you wouldn't pay more, right? We have to have the same thing for music. There has to be ubiquitous payment for music that's wrapped up into other services. And we'll find this is already happening, for example, with AT&T and Napster. You have an AT&T subscription, you get the Napster music thing for free. That would work great except for the DRM, right, which doesn't work great. So, and then there's already several sort of flat rate proposals cruising around the world, including in China and in India, to where you essentially pay, but it's part of the access,
So let me ask you this. from the point of view of the artist and the creator and the creative work, are you saying that the relationship with the audience has changed such that there's now much more of a direct conduit between the creator and the audience that is not intermediated as much by the record company or the music publishing company as might have been the case 15, 20 years ago?
Well, I think that's essentially because the paradigm has changed in a way that music companies and, of course, film companies or TV companies are not just selling a product anymore. You know, the record companies used to be all about unit sales, right?
And this was analog sales of CDs. That was the end product.
Well, it's basically the end product could also be considered a download. I mean, that's a unit as well, right?
Correct.
So
what was the fundamental change to allow the download civilization to really accelerate? What were some of the drivers, the catalytic converters, as it were, to making this change?
Yeah,
was it the internet?
I think that, you know, if you're looking at this, at the general subject here, is iTunes is still very much a unit-based economy. To what we're switching to right now, literally this year, is an access-based economy. This is basically saying that record companies will not be counting how many units they've sold, but how many clicks they've gotten to the access of the content.
Right. So when the Napster revolution started some 10, 12 years ago, when did Sean Fanning actually come up with it?
It was 1997.
Okay, so
98.
We're now a decade later. We're now in a situation where the entire basis of the way that the music industry works has literally been turned upside down.
Right. I think essentially it was apparent then that this was going to be the model. I mean, Napster offered, I think, some huge amount of money for an experimental license for an access charge to Napster. That was already on the table in '99. In fact, Bertelsmann invested in Napster.
Bertelsmann is the German giant that is one of the partners in Sony BMG,
Right.
and were the people who actually bought Napster.
I think they invested in Napster, didn't actually buy it. They invested in Napster. And it was clear back then that if they were able to charge access fees to Napster and also wrap advertising into it, they would probably make more money than if they were pursuing the unit sales.
So what you're saying, therefore, is that the record labels who traditionally would have gone to retail, once the internet started, want to keep control, some of the control mechanisms have had to be completely changed or have become fragmented and drifted away.
Yeah, I think given that the music industry, as opposed to television or film, is a fairly protected environment. You know, it's basically an inside environment. I mean, nobody knew what was going on here until you had the internet, so you could Google them, right? I mean, it was essentially controlled, non-transparent environment. So when we have the situation changing now, is that everybody understands what goes on. You know, what kind of contracts you have. You know, the fact that most artists never make any money selling music to begin with because of this system. So now all of this is changing, and it leads to sort of a tidal change to where the record companies become entertainment companies and essentially agencies, right? They are the ones who are going to take talent, develop it, and just put it out there, right?
So what you're saying is that the role of the music company is still to discover the talent, but the control of that talent that they discover has now shifted from the record label directly to the artist. In other words, the artist has much more power and control in terms of their future.
Well, I think that is happening everywhere. It's basically the creator who has the control, of course, what he creates and when he creates it, and the user, right? The user who basically, just like the airline business, the user says, well, you know, frankly, I don't care that much about an assigned seat. I just want to book on the internet, be able to switch my flight schedule, you know. And,
Right.
and Swiss Air has completely missed the boat on this and was sold for, what, 1/10 of the value to Lufthansa.
Right.
And the same thing is happening here, EMI being bought by Terra Firma.
Now, Terra Firma is a hedge fund in London
Right.
that acquired EMI. So effectively now, a hedge fund on the London Stock Exchange controls the Beatles, it controls the Beach Boys, it controls well, not Radiohead anymore, but certainly controls a huge catalogue.
This was the kind of thing we actually projected in the book, The Future of Music, right?
That's what I want, yes.
Because we saw this coming. I mean, if you look at Warner Music right now, their valuation is like, you know, down there somewhere. The publishing company is worth more than the entire stock market valuation they have.
So let's just focus on this question of the future of music. What you were saying is the future has changed such that it's no longer totally dependent upon selling your music through retail. Selling online is really the dominant form by which the younger generation of music consumers, and I don't even think you can call them consumers anymore. What would you call them?
Well,
today?
there's two things here. First is that we have to face that our future in media in general is based on the digital natives.
What is a digital native?
We're old compared to those people. I mean, if you're looking at the overall scope of things, a digital native is somebody who grows up with digital technology at their fingertips.
So wouldn't this generally be the primary generation of music consumers if, let's say, the demographic for the main consumption of music is, let's say, 12 to 28 or 12 to 30. Let's use that band. Would you say that that generation are, in fact, the digital natives of today?
In fact, there's two trends here. One is that the kids who are growing up today, and I would take this from 10 to 20 sort of range, right? They're completely used to an access-based model. I mean, they click to get, right? That's what they do on Napster, I mean on MySpace, what they used to do on Napster, and that's what they do on YouTube. They click to get, and they do the same on the phone, see the iPhone, and the N95. They produce their own content, they remix it. And then there's a second group of people who are between 30 and 50 who are now completely switching and saying, wait a minute, I used to go out and buy this CD because I want one track. Now I can go to iTunes and stuff and they get to cherry pick. And those are also changing. So we have the digital natives. We have what I call digital immigrants, which are people in that sort of range that are switching, right? And the analogs, as they're called, right? People who are not plugged in, they're basically evaporating. So the music and the media business has to be built on giving the digital natives what they want, which is primarily access based on content and then the selling, right? The whole obsession with selling stuff, that's what kills the music business. The obsession with saying, if you want this, you got to put the money first.
So doesn't this provide a conflict for the creator or the creative individuals making the music, where they construct a song, they record something, let's just assume that it's got some real appeal.
Mm-hmm.
In the mindset of the creator now, what is the pathway that this new future of music is determining? Someone creates, do they then set up their own website? Do they basically promote it themselves? Because in this area of ubiquity, isn't one of the big tests of the future of music how you rise above the clutter?
It's all about attention. It always has been. Right? If you're a band that doesn't play gigs, you're not going to get any attention. Right? So in this system of getting attention, it's basically when you release something, right, and you do things to funnel the attention, that's when you get the money, not the other way around. You don't release something and say, now pay me so I can show you that I'm good. Right? It's the other way around now. You offer something, and then you find a way to promote it through various things and tie-ins, for example, sponsorships and tours, playing live, doing things on the web. Like a lot of good bands have been doing, like, starting from Fish to the Bare Naked Ladies to the Arctic Monkeys, and there's hundreds of bands now that do this, right?
So if the new John Lennon had to emerge within this new cosmos, what are some of the ways in which a John Lennon might be discovered and a broader community get to know about them? Can you think of any examples of somebody that's actually fueled a grassroots appeal that has then evolved into something significant?
Well, there are several examples, including, for example, Prince, who was not a very good example because obviously he got started in the old model, right? But this is very much like blogging. It's entirely based on merit and work. I mean, this is a very Darwinistic system, right? If you're good, people will come back.
How do they find out? How do you rise above the clutter?
They find out from the others, right?
So how does that process actually work, or will work in the future?
I think the blogging world is a great parallel to this, right? As a blogger, what happens is you publish things, and then people run across you by using search engines and basically by other people linking back to you. So the more people link, it's very hard to sort of stay at the bottom, but at a certain pivot point, you end up going, it just explodes.
But if you've got nearly 100 million blogs now on a global basis and growing, there's some exponential number that's growing every month, how does the community get to know and spread the word such that one person tells another, which is really a function that radio played a big role in with the record industry pre the internet,
Yeah.
as it still does, of course, because people have got to get to hear something. Is it that there's a whole new realm of citizen dissemination?
I think there's two things that are important here. One is that our hit-based economy has eroded.
What do you mean by hit-based economy?
It used to be that only the top 2 get listened to, or as I say in music, of course, the top 100, right?
Right.
So that's what get listened to, that's what is in the store, that's what you can buy, that's what's available. So 10 years ago, you go to the record store, you go in to buy John Coltrane Love Supreme, they don't have it, you walk out with Elton John, right? Because that was also okay to buy, right? Today, that doesn't happen anymore because when you go on the web to buy Love Supreme, you're going to find Love Supreme, right? So what happens is...
So what you're saying is that there's an endless stock of music that you can choose. The inventory is not limited by the shelf space in a retail environment.
Having that sort of choice creates diversity, which means that hits have a much harder time of existing. For example, in television, which is a very good parallel, in the 50s, Gunsmoke or Dallas, I think Dallas wasn't around in the 50s.
Dallas was in the 70s.
Yeah, it was in the 70s. But Gunsmoke or I Love Lucy got 70% of Americans watching it. Right? Today, if you're lucky, American Idol gets 11, 12, 14, which is probably not even correct, but somewhere in that neighborhood, right? And some people are saying that pretty soon is going to be 4 or 5% will be a fantastic number to get of ubiquitous viewership, right? So what that means is that because people have more choices, you'll have 5,000 TV channels, it'll spread out. Right?
So this notion of fragmenting and looking at musical tastes, are you saying that in the future of music, there's going to be even greater fragmentation? There'll be a niche that an artist or a band or a writer can find themselves in. And if you can attract people to your niche, even if it's smaller than the mass pop market, you as an artist will actually be in a better position than were you to have gone the traditional model with signing to a record company.
Well, what you want to do in a way is you want to be the hit in the niche, right? So
give us an example of who you
you
see as actually being that. Is Jack Johnson somebody who fulfills that?
Maybe, but I'm looking at more like labels like ECM Records for jazz, you know.
Now, ECM is a German-based company that specialized in esoteric jazz music.
Yes, and Manfred Eicher, who's the main producer, he's succeeded in building a brand to where ECM Records is the hit.
But it is
jazz.
a very small label by global standards.
I think they're actually a fairly large business, and the same could be argued for things like Putumayo World Music, you know, who create, Dan Storber, who creates series of world music compilations from Morocco and the Caribbean, and they're everywhere around the world in coffee shops and new age shops and doing
So is
great
this
business.
part of the fragmentation that you were alluding to?
Absolutely, and I think when you're looking at this in a digital way, so you don't have physical distribution issues, you know, this becomes essentially a publishing pipeline, you know, to where if you are successful, you release it, and the distribution is a default, right? In the old days, you'd have to actually make the record, make the cover, ship the record, get it into the store, whether it's Starbucks or a record store, doesn't matter. You have to get it out there. Today, distribution essentially is a default, right? I mean, if you release it online, it'll be available, right? Whether it's licensed or not, you know, it's a different discussion, right? But distribution is a default, and very much the same thing is true for television now, right? To where a lot of producers who are now rejected by the major networks are going to publish direct using outlets like Kite TV, like YouTube, like Rever. And this is, we've only seen the peak of the beginning
The start
of this,
of it.
right? I mean, this is a total, like, you know, most of the iceberg is underwater, right?
Gerd, I'd like to ask you a question. In today's world where more people are consuming more music than has ever been the case before, has music become commoditized, or has music become more targeted?
I think basically in the scenario that we have today, music is absolutely ubiquitous, right? It's absolutely everywhere. Listen, I mean, if you say using, I think we have to be aware of the fact that the issue of downloading, buying or owning music is completely merging with listening. I mean, broadcasting is essentially receiving of music, right? I mean, digital radio is distribution, right? So if we talk about this issue of saying that, you know, you used to buy a CD, then you own the music, but you listen to the radio, you don't own the music, that's not true anymore. I can just save it on my memory card, right? A digital audio broadcast stream requires a button that says record, right? And so that's really the same thing. So in the end, what's happening is that access to music and using to music has to be ubiquitously licensed to the end user, very much like radio.
But in an earlier time where music was so important, today the demographic that are the main music buyers on a global basis, don't they have other interests? The internet is just one of a number of different elements competing for their attention. And so therefore the issue is, in this age of ubiquity, what are some of the things that one can do to get that attention? What do you have to do to be able to rise through this mass of ubiquity?
I think with any medium, this is really about finding the point of attention. What people really like. I mean, it's about hitting a nerve. I mean, any songwriter knows this, right? You write a song that hits the nerve.
Well, that's the object of songwriting.
Yeah, that's the object of any content you create. I mean, you can be a painter, and your picture doesn't hit the nerve now, but 100 years from now it does. You just won't be around to witness it, right? So with all media, you have to hit the nerve of what you're trying to get to, right? And that is not going to change, right?
That is not going to change.
No, that's what the creator does. It hits the nerve. So if I do a TV show that fits in a certain environment, it may be absolutely useless in Korea, but it may grow great in the US because it hits the nerve there. So that isn't going to change. It also, I think, with the ubiquitous means of production, like GarageBand or Acid or Pro Tools. Or,
so these are sites that do what? Those sites do what?
Well, they're services that essentially allow people to produce at very low cost. GarageBand is in every Mac. So GarageBand is a software where I can take tracks and puzzle them together and then rap over it if I want to. And people are producing records that way. But for me, also blogging, similar world, or podcasting, I think ultimately talent, real talent to hit the nerve, right, is finite still. The tools of production are becoming more, but the real ability to do that, the real Hendrix, Miles Davis, George Irving type creators, there aren't going to be a lot more just because I have more means of production. So what I'm saying is that I think that what's going on is that we can go out there and put stuff out, as I'm doing myself with the blog or as a writer. But I'm realizing that if the quality isn't there, I'm not getting an audience.
Okay, let me give you a hypothetical. We have 4 young people that have decided to start a band. One of the 4 is very involved in the internet. They decide that what they will have to do is they're going to be playing in their local area, so they do have a performance ethic. They want to be able to establish a little platform for that particular group. They establish a website. They tell people in their local area where they'll be playing. Do they have to do more than have a website today?
Well, I think today it's of course you have to have a website, which is a window essentially, right? But really it's about syndication. You take what you do and you open it up for people to use, right? And
so this would traditionally have been the responsibility of the record label.
Right. And syndication today is digital, right? So the hottest trend here is what I call the widgetization of media.
The widgetization of media. So first of all, explain what is a widget?
A widget is essentially a flash-based, using flash technology, a media player. And you can cut and paste and put it onto your own website or any site that you have access to.
So give me an example of something like this.
Well, YouTube is the most popular example, right? So you put your video up, as soon as you put it up, it becomes available as a piece of code. And it sounds kind of geeky, but it's done, it's widely done.
Right.
So you take this code, you copy it, and then you go to your blog, to your homepage, to your Insta profile, wherever it fits, and you dump this player into it, and it will pull the content from YouTube. In fact, 60%, I think, of YouTube traffic is based on code being pulled on external sites. Right? And again, this sounds a little bit geeky because of the nature of the technology, but it's becoming standard. There's 250 million people doing this already, right? Pulling in outside code, right? And I think we're going to do the same thing with this show, obviously, which is to distribute through other platforms. So you don't have to come to GerdLeonhard.net to watch the show, or even to FutureTalks.com. You can watch it on other sites. And I think this is becoming a major phenomenon with companies like, here in San Francisco called Kite.tv, right, and Brad Cove in Boston, right, who are essentially syndicators. And in radio, this is an old phenomenon, is that you have to syndicate to get the audience, right? So the same for music, going back to your question. As a musician, I want to be syndicated. I want people to pick up my music, put it everywhere. Right? This is why I started my new company, Sonific, as a syndication tool.
Well, we're going to get onto that in a minute. But if we're looking at this mass ubiquity that's going on, isn't this going to lead to a lot of mediocrity as far as music is concerned? How does the cream rise to the top? Do you think that there's enough of a mechanism within the internet and within this new internet community to be able to identify the next John Lennon or to identify the next Kurt Cobain.
I think it's actually the other way around, Ralph. I think that mediocrity is what we had when there was a control channel, because people who would program for an audience of 30 million, they have to hit the nerve of 30 million people. So that call that mediocrity, right? Because they have to actually consider all these people's bandwidth. Can't do anything that is too challenging for 30 million people, right? I can do something extremely challenging for 500 people, but I'm not going to sell like ads that are worth $2 million, you know? So the issue there is that I think what's happened with mediocrity on the web is clearly described by things like NetVibes or Google. You know, whatever is good comes to the top, right? Because of clicks.
What is that process now in this media-saturated society? How does word spread? And is this quicker? Is the pickup quicker than it traditionally used to be? And will it be faster in the future?
This is one of my arguments is for the lessening of the term of copyright, is that it's much, much quicker now, because essentially what we're talking about, the process of use is a process of linking, right? You know me, so rather than coming to my house, which you're welcome to, and look at my CD collection, you can just go to my link and my profile on Facebook and you say, oh, that's pretty cool. Gert has 500 songs that I may like. I take those links. Right? And that's what kids are doing today, right? They don't go to the BBC, or they still do, of course, but you know, they don't go to the BBC to find necessarily the next John Peel, which will continue as well. They go to each other on Bebo and say, oh, let's see what John has put up now. And John has been watching this movie clip, John has been doing this and that, right? And that's how they connect to each other, right? So it's this mechanism of social recommendation, which used to be happening in coffee shops and in live concert venues, right? Is being not replaced, but is being added to by the internet, social network and platform, by the interaction that people have there, right? So going back to your question, I think what creates here is the opposite of mediocrity, is because it's extremely pressure environment, right? When you have that many things happening, right? That only the really sort of the cream will definitely rise to the top in a way that's much quicker, much more reliant, right? The only question there remains is, how do you do that before it's obvious, right? And this is where A&R comes in for the record companies.
A&R being the creative talent scouts who spot and develop the talent.
And like, you know, any writer, any film producer, any band, you know, if it's already on the stage and playing at Glastonbury, and people have obviously voted and clicked for it, then it's kind of obvious, right? But how do I get the next Aretha Franklin when she isn't already on stage sparkling with everyone, you know? This is what happened with Norah Jones. And that will take
explain the Norah Jones story, because here's Norah Jones, a complete unknown. She makes a series of recordings. Her first debut album sells 18 million copies, an enormous success. And people said that part of the reason for this was of the purity contained within her music itself, where her audience recognized a purity in an otherwise mechanized musical environment.
I think this is a skill that is going to be, as it always has been, very essential to media, is to recognize that sparkle before it already sparkles.
Right. And would you say that in this age of the digital native, it's not just about audio, it's about a multimedia identity? Because if we're working in an environment and with a constellation of communities that are used to a multimedia environment, the ubiquity of television, the ubiquity of the internet, it also means that the really successful artists, like a Madonna, to choose a contemporary example, even though she's now 49 years old, she's certainly the most successful female recording artist in history, probably apart from Shania Twain, that holds the record for the biggest selling album by a female artist, some 32 million copies. Today, in the creative process, does a creative artist have to think of more than just audio? Do they have to think of visual? Do they have to think of making filmed content? Give us some idea of the future of the creative process.
I think that, you know, by default, there's two things that are completely different today. Is you as an artist are a brand. If you're also a performer, then it's by default multimedia, visual, audio, and everything. And the other thing is that you essentially, you have to think of the back channel, the interactivity. People want to also talk to you and chat with you.
Explain a little bit about the so-called back channel. What do you mean by that?
Well, in old media, you could say, or mainstream media, it's essentially top down, right? It's dropped on you, right? You can switch on or you can switch off, but It's just dropped.
Like radio or like television.
Right. There's no back channel. Well, of course, you can send them a letter if you want, but today, media is completely interactive. That means I pull it. Like if I subscribe to my reader, my feed reader on Google, the content comes to me. Like if I subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, it comes to me because I pull it in, right?
So this is you decide what you want to pull into your realm of experience. It's not being pushed towards you and you then deciding whether you should opt in or not.
But the interesting part is that these things exist in complete parallelity, right?
What does that mean?
They don't replace each other. We have mass mediums that is being dumped on people. That's going to continue, right? But there's no growth. The biggest problem we're seeing right now is that advertisers are deserting the mass medium to the pull medium, right? Because it's much more targeted and much more direct, and it's an opt-in process, right? So going back to your question about music, I think what we're seeing right now is that the biggest trend in music is to create attraction that pulls people in using any means possible, which means that you have to move the toll booth a little bit further down the road, right? For example, streaming on social networks is a great platform to be discovered. If you have 150,000 plays a day, then you can be sure you can turn that into money. If you can't turn that into money, then there's a big fault in your presentation.
So does this mean that you've got to make a quirky video that you upload onto YouTube? I know there was a recent example of an American band that used a very simple process of effectively using a treadmill, a couple of treadmills, doing dance steps on a treadmill. They loaded it up onto YouTube, immediate response, which really was the essence that got the group going rather than the more traditional route of going through an MTV.
It's all about having unique stuff, having good ideas, hitting the nerve, finding something that has a sparkle.
So this is not new.
I can tell you on my own blog, for example, the most popular post I ever did was about the iPhone blender. A guy who puts the iPhone in a blender and blends the phone, right? And I just put it there with a video from YouTube, and that is the most hits I've ever gotten because it hit the nerve of people having fun with iTunes, with iPhone.
So what did the video actually do?
Well, you go to YouTube, put an iPhone blender, you could see it. But, it was funny. It was just funny, just a joke on iPhone. But, that sort of thing shows that if you hit the nerve of people at the right time, they will flock to it, right? So my traffic went, I had a 10-time spike that day. And also noticing from my own blog as well, when the content that I post is really unique and powerful, and I've worked on it very hard, my traffic goes up 100 times. And then if I don't do that, it drops. So I'm subject to the very same Darwinism, as I call it, digital Darwinism. Sounds like a good book title. Where basically you could say that is what's happening everywhere. So it's based on merit. I mean, like it always has for artists. It's based on merit. So,
is this also part of a future trend of people personalizing their consumption, but going to a degree of detail and depth that we haven't actually seen before in either entertainment or in the way that people consume media?
I mean, I think I wouldn't be too adventurous on this. I think that 80% or maybe even 90% of people will never do their own programming in the sense that we do it because we love music or we love TV. A lot of people will use robots or engines. I call it the electronic programming guide of the future.
This is almost like recommendations. If you like Metallica, you will like
if
the Kings of Leon.
If you live in Berkeley, you like KPFA, you're going to listen to their world music show. If you like Hearts of Space and ambient music, you listen to Stephen Hill, right? If you like what John Peel did at
John Peel is the famous English.
Used to be at Armed Forces Networks in Europe when I listened to it. Then he went to the BBC. If you like those people sorting for you, then you use them. Otherwise, you can use Pandora, you can use Sonific, you can use Last.fm.
Now tell us about Sonific. Sonific is a company that you founded. And what does Sonific actually do?
Well, Sonific, we founded this 2 years ago because we realized that the most desired thing that people want to do on the web is to customize their own stuff, right, to be different. This goes for dating sites, it goes for social networks, for stuff like MySpace and even LinkedIn.
So on social networks, just give us an idea of the scope and the importance today of social networks. How big is this phenomenon? I mean, we know about MySpace, Facebook, Bebo, the trinity of leaders in that space, but Give us some idea of the depth of this. Is this a global phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, I think it's one of the biggest trends that we're seeing in media and parenthesis today is that it has become so easy to self-publish. It used to be like you need the skills of a programmer to make a web page. Now there's like 1,000 services, including Google Pages and Web Creator and Site Creator and, you know, and Yahoo and whatever. You can make a page in an instant without having to do anything. I mean, my mother could do it today, right? Using standard templates.
So, as far as Sonific is concerned, and this company you decided to found, is this using some of this new thinking? Just tell us what does Sonific actually do?
Yeah, well, Sonific provides music widgets, right? Music players, essentially, that people can drop into their own websites.
Right.
So the idea is very much to say, well, like a ringtone, you know, I put music on my personal page on gertleonhardt.net, or I put it on my MySpace page or wherever, and it sort of tells people who I am. You know, there's been a recent study by Oldswang about social media. It's a UK company. And basically what it says is that almost 39% of people and 60% of teenagers have added music to their online profiles, community sites, personal web pages. And that is the top thing that people want, is they want to sonify, in parentheses.
So it's almost like their personality badge.
Absolutely. I mean, if you come to my website, let's say I'm on a dating site, okay, which we cover a lot, right? And I'm looking for a friend or a date or whatever, then if I play Norwegian punk music, I'm a completely different guy, right? Or if you come to my social network, come to my webpage. And, you know, we have several thousand people who have massage therapists and sort of healing practices, right? They use that as a soundtrack. As an example, in hotels, for every boutique hotel, that website you go to today has music on the website in some place, like an intro, to set the vibe, you know. This is like the sound icon, right? And this is going to be total default. I think in 2 or 3 years, there won't be anything left on the internet that does not have an audio component or a multimedia component, essentially making websites into a bit of a TV channel each.
So, getting back to this whole notion of citizen publishing, citizen broadcasting, citizen creativity, Sonific does what regarding music?
Yeah, Sonific is the framework for all of the record labels and publishers to basically submit to the social network. So right now, it's a crowd of 225 million people, about 750 websites. You know, we have already made deals with 43 of them, so we're pretty much on the way. We cover Facebook and Google, Blogger, Typepad, WordPress, MySpace, and so on and so on. And we basically have created a plugin that allows people to post music on these websites. And we license every single song from record companies. There's about 200
music publishers.
Music publishers as well. 225,000 songs that we currently have in the repertoire. Some hits and some sort of more long-tail stuff, right? There's some forward-thinking major labels are part of this as well, including RCA in the UK and Columbia Records in the UK, that are essentially publishing through us, because people will then discover the music and click through and do something, whether they join a blog, buy a download, order on Amazon, you know. So 10% of our users actually click through and do something with the music, which is a
So
fantastic
isn't this now one of the big conundrum for record labels, big or small, where the issue really is how you spread the word, and what is it going to be that gets people to discover? And the whole notion of discovery and discovering new trends or new music, this is clearly a puzzle that many of the media industries try and solve. How does a writer become popular? How does a ad become popular?
But you know, you discover me or my music or my art in the context of something else.
Right.
That is the key, right? You don't have to come to mtv.com to discover. You can come anywhere on the web to discover, and that's what's happening right now, is that all these websites are becoming satellites of each other, and discovery of content is possible anywhere now, right? Because I can syndicate my content through these little players that create windows of content, right? That's essentially what's happening everywhere. When you go to MySpace or Facebook, you see all those little windows of, you know, media content, of videos that have been uploaded, of chats that are going on. They're all being brought in from the outside, right? So the new web, this is the whole definition of Web 2.0, as it impacts also media 2.0, right? Is that content is now ubiquitous in different places. So the whole notion of having a central place is greatly diminished. Right? This is what is the result of search, right? Because ultimately I search to find, and then wherever it is, I go there. Right? So in a real life world, that isn't possible because of distribution constraints. It would be too expensive. But in a virtual world, all the content is mirrored all over the place. Right? In other words, for example, the new definition of radio is essentially fishing for that content like Project Playlist does, which is similar to what Sonific does, but without a license, is to combine the streams of the web and make a program out of it. Right? So the whole concept of Web 2.0 is essentially a decentral concept.
So essentially, the whole notion of fragmentation is a fundamental part of the future. We're going to see even more fragmentation so that you get the specialized niche of a niche of a niche.
Absolutely. And I think, however, paradoxically enough, I think we will also have hits in those niches to where there is like lead fragmentizers. You know, like in the blogging world, Boing Boing is one of those. You know, they fragment and they put it back together again, right? So it's essentially, in a way, that's what I'm doing. You know, I take all the fragmented stuff and I put it back together and I give it back to somebody else in a concise way, right? So, and this is what impacts copyright, right? Because if you, as Larry Lessig says, you know, in a read-only world, right, I can only go somewhere and read or consume what's there. You know, I can't do anything. I can't remix. I can't send it back. I can't share it, right? In a read-write world, I can read this and then write on it and then send it to you, right? And this is essentially what the internet is, what it does, right? Because every computer is a copy machine, right? So I can use this in a way of saying, if I can only read it, then it's essentially back to the newspaper. I can read the newspaper or throw it away. You know, I can't cut it out and then, you know, collate it and send it back to the New York Times to publish, right? But the web does that. The web allows for interactivity and for sharing, right? So I can make a playlist of 25 songs, for example, on Sonific. I can put a message to it and say, hey, Ralph, these are really cool world music songs I found on CD Baby through Sonific. Listen to it, I'll send it to you. Right? That's quite different than saying go to MTV.com and look at the greatest hits. Right? And I think there will always be people who do that are just consumers. And this is why I like to use the term people formerly known as consumers. You know, because many of those people are now becoming contextual creators of this. Right? And this is a trend that we see absolutely everywhere. We see it in television, we see it in film.
Has this been the phenomenon of DJs mixing up different songs and basically fragmenting the music itself to create a form that appeals to those fans of the dance category?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, it has always been that way. I mean, Bob Dylan said basically the best artist is a remixer, or something to that effect, right? So there isn't a single writer who isn't influenced by other people.
Of course.
Right? So today, what's happening with digital technology is because there's such a huge flow of input, is that I can sort of piece this together, right? And with music, that's becoming increasingly easy because of technical means like GarageBand.
But isn't this also diluting some of the creativity where people are now going to fragment so much that does real originality still have a chance to flourish and surface?
Well, I think it's just, because there's a sort of you could say there is the noise level is outrageous, right? There's no doubt about that. But because the noise level is high, it does not mean that ultimately I think somebody who has real merit gets to the top very quickly, because basically in this sort of environment, it'll be extremely quick. I mean, you can publish something and people can trample it and call it, you know, whatever bad things, you know, like in half an hour on the web. I mean, you can see applications or website launching, and within 2 hours, the blogosphere, you know, where people are blogging, has smashed it to pieces, and you'll never hear of it again, right? And
equally, if something is on the other side of that idea, there will be a massive pickup by a great community. I know there was a video a couple of years ago of two young Chinese guys who did an a cappella version of an old Backstreet Boys song that was loaded up onto YouTube and became an international phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Similarly, a young Indonesian guitar player who could play extremely fast suddenly had a world audience that came out of nothing. What I'm interested to try and determine in the future of music and the future of media is, what are those catalytic points? What triggers something like that? Is this a small group of people that immediately grows, almost like a flash mob does, into a larger constituency? What is that process? How does that suddenly happen?
I think that goes back to the hitting the nerve kind of idea. This is something that artists do. They determine where that spot is, where they put it, and why they do it at this time. If you look at what Michael Moore has done with his movies, that would have been 15 years ago. Nobody would have paid attention.
To a documentary maker.
Yeah, and if Jimi Hendrix came up today playing on his Stratocaster and putting his amp on fire, that certainly wouldn't be much to talk about today, because in those days it was like, this man is from the moon. Right? It's about timing. It's about also location still. Right? It's about fitting in. It's about hitting the nail on the head, at the right time. So
if you were giving some advice to a group of musicians, and they came to you and they said, we have full confidence in what we write. We know we're writing great material.
Right.
We know that when it's recorded, all of our friends really like it. What do we need to do now? We've got the music. What's the route map of how we now go?
I think the answer to that is really, it's all about exposure and attention. Everything you can do to get exposure, within reason, right? And attention is what you should be doing as a band, as a writer, as a filmmaker, right? So basically that means initially this is a freebie business, because you don't have any leverage, right? You put your music up for downloading, you put it up for streaming, you put up your profiles, you make a blog. All these things are free, right? This is one very important difference. Right?
So this is really the democratization of the elements of production.
Yeah, I think what we have to face is quite obviously, at a certain curve, when you're starting with something, you prefer the exposure over money. There's no way you're going to get the money without exposure. Everybody knows that, right? You can't put up your music and say, pay $1 to listen.
But wouldn't it also be correct in saying that in the future of music, it won't only be about the music or the song. It has to be about some visual element, some internet element, some blogging element, some kind of participative element that your wider audience can immediately connect with to you.
It's always going to be about engagement, and really always has been, except for the sort of artificial period of the music industry where they tried to sell plastic, as the embodiment of the engagement, you could say.
Right.
But it's always about engagement, right? So engagement, exposure, attention, that's really what you want to go for. So initially, you sacrifice the immediate coming back of money because you're looking for attention. In other words, you may be inclined to give your music for free for an ad, or not. That depends on who you are. Or you may be inclined to say, well, there's a game production, so I'm not going to ask for $1 million for this license. I'm going to license my song for $50,000. But when you've grown to a certain status, then you say, well, I'm not so sure I need to give a license for $50,000 to get exposure because I've already reached my place. It's a question of leverage. Robbie Williams doesn't need Electronic Arts to put him on a soundtrack, even if they would ask him.
Robbie Williams is the English artist who has a tremendous following in Europe, but has been conspicuous by not being successful in the United States. Why do you think that is? Ken?
Mildly successful. I think he has some followership here, but I think that the way he presents himself and what he does is particular to what people like in Europe. And for some reason, he doesn't seem to hit that nerve here, but I think he may eventually do that. But it's, as you grow as an artist, whether it's a filmmaker or a blogger or as a writer or as a musician, initially you do things to get traction. And then later you can turn that around a little bit and put up the toll booth a little bit earlier, right? And that is a very natural process. So we can't just make rules that say it should be all free across the board, because it doesn't have to be, right? But at a certain point, I think you have to convert the intention into money. And you can do that by being part of subscription services, licensing, branding, advertising.
So doesn't this all mean that music today is a loss leader for an artist's wider activities? Someone might make music that they'd give away for free, but that might then supplement their concert revenues, their...
No, I don't think it means that at all. I think what basically our view has been distorted by the CD revolution. The CD came around and was essentially a reissue of the music, right? And it made so much money that everybody thought, wow, this is great, just let's keep on doing this, right? But music has always been about the brand. It has always been a revenue flow of 50 different things. Live concerts, merchandising, ticketing, contract work, motion picture scores, games, licensing, all these things that have to do with the brand of the artist. So we're going back to this now, to where the artist brand and what he stands for, what he does, that's the value of the music.
So do you feel that we're in an optimistic environment? Do you think the future of music offers far greater opportunity than it might have done in an analog era?
I think, again, going back to what you said earlier, I think the opportunity is huge because we're merging now music and visual arts are coming together. So as a music company, as a musician, I'm a complete multimedia experience, right? So I can sell all of these things in different places, and this is why I'm very optimistic about this. At the same time, I would caution to say that because of the democratizing of the means of production, that the pressure from top of the funnel will be fundamental, right? So I got to be really good to be listened to.
Or really unique, or really original. So originality is still the key.
I think that's absolutely the key, and I think if there's one piece of advice, for musicians and artists and even labels, is to be unique, to be different, to be the king of the niche, so to speak, right? Because that is really ultimately, that's the place you can have.
The king of the niche. That's what people have got to look for, the king or the queen of the niche. Because if you do that, that will then mushroom and grow for you in a way that might completely surpass all of your expectations.
Well, I mean, let's face it, I mean, hip-hop was a niche market. Now it's a mainstream, right? So this doesn't mean that you can't eventually be, a huge cultural icon, so to speak, But I think it will be much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to be Gunsmoke, Dallas, or the Rolling Stones today, simply because of diversity of choice.
Right. Well, Gerd, these have been interesting ideas in which certainly stimulate a lot of thinking, certainly ideas for creatives and for musicians and for those people that want to understand how you get to a wider global audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Ralph Simon. I'm the host of Future Talks, and today we are very privileged to have with us one of the world's most distinguished futurists, Glenn Heemstra. Glenn is the author of a very, very important book called Turning the Future into Revenue, which we're going to discuss during the course of our talk, and also just examining the whole notion of the future's impact, and how we are going to perceive what the future will bring to us now. Glenn, a warm welcome to Future Talks. Really great to have you here on this show.
Thank you.
Glenn, one of the things I want to just raise with you is the future, as you've said on your website, is creatable. And the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we can actually plan for.
That's true. The premise of the book essentially can be boiled down to a somewhat counterintuitive, but as soon as you stop to think about it, kind of obvious point, which is that the future creates the present. We think of life as a situation in which people did things in the past that gave us the world that we're all living in today, and that we're making more or less important decisions today, and that's going to give us the world of tomorrow. But in an interesting way, the images that we have of the future come back to us and tell us what we ought to be paying attention to, what we ought to be getting ready for, or what we ought to be trying to avoid, or what we ought to be trying to create. And so if you want to change what you're doing today, and this is what I do when I'm working with organizations, if you want to change what you're doing today, the most important thing you can do, the most valuable leverage point for change, is to change what you think about tomorrow, what tomorrow looks like to you. And if you change that in a way that is powerful, people will behave differently in today's world.
So are you saying, therefore, that wisdom of the future is really about studying basic needs, then projecting in chunks of time, what would you say would be the chunks of time that you're looking at? Would you be looking at how to think in 25-year fragments, 50-year fragments, 10-year fragments?
Yes. That's always an interesting question. Whenever an organization wants to, or a person really says, how far ahead should I look? The standard is 3 years, 5 years. And in today's very fast-paced world and internet-based time and all of that, people began to believe that it was kind of a waste of time to look more than a few months ahead. And we still have this debate all the time. But and the longest-term project I ever worked on, by the way, was one in which we tried to look 1,000 years ahead.
Now, how is that,
and that was
possible? I mean, that would really be a bit of a stretch intellectually, isn't it?
It was a big stretch, and it turned out to be very hard. The question, it was a foundation, provided a bunch of money, invited a bunch of scientists from around the world based on the idea that they might actually know the answer to this question. And the question was, what will it take for humanity to survive for another 1,000 years?
But these are very fundamental.
But those, and what we came, the conclusion was, after a lot of conversation, was it takes a certain change in values. When I'm working, in a more realistic way, that was a very interesting project. I'd love to do anything like that anytime. But most organizations want something that's more practical, and so I am arguing, and the book argues, that you ought to look a decade or two ahead, not because you're trying to figure out what you're going to be doing in a decade or two, but so that you have a better chance of seeing what you ought to be doing next year and the year after,
right,
because of what's out there. Why a decade or two? If you only look 3 to 5 years out, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and yet at the same time you know that not that much will change. If you look a decade or two, you know that things could be very different. And the way you know that is you look back a couple of decades and you see how different the world was. 2 decades ago, no World Wide Web. So you have to assume that sometime in the next couple of decades there's going to be a change as significant as that. Well, to what extent can you tease out what some of the features of that might be, and what does that tell you ought to be paying attention to in the next year or two? That's a time period. I also like the time period of 1 or 2 decades because everybody who's looking at it can imagine, with some luck, still being alive. And so they think, well, this will actually matter to me. If we do some things that change the world in a decade or two, I'll still be around to see it. If you go further than that, then they think, well, I'm not going to be around anyway.
So it becomes less relevant.
It becomes less relevant. It's still important, but it's less relevant to people. And so that time period, 1, 2 decades, turns out to be a very good time period to stimulate creative thinking and yet be close enough that it seems real.
So, Glenn, if we look back historically and look back where people trying to determine the future would have been called prophets to a certain extent. If you take Nostradamus as one of the great historical figures, even Rasputin, if you look at Eastern Europe for an example. But when one thinks of the development of the study of the future, when was this as a study, when did it really start to manifest as being a serious intent? Because it would seem to me that studying the future would have been important to army generals, to basically the development of a state.
Yeah, it depends on how you really want to define it. The idea, obviously, of contingency planning and imagining different alternatives that might or might not occur was important in military affairs, and was important in civic affairs, large-scale planning. But the field of, let's call it future studies or futurism in Europe, sometimes they refer to it as futurology, became kind of an academic field in the 1960s. Interestingly, I think it kind of coincided with the space program and the idea that we might expand off the planet. And also with the telecommunications revolution that was going on that allowed, easier communications across continents, and interestingly also with jet airplane travel that made travel faster. And so people began to sense the pace was picking up and that large things were happening that would have planetary scale kinds of impacts. And so people began to study that. And there's a famous book by a Dutch futurist named Frederik Pollack called The Image of the Future. And he was really a historian. He wrote the book actually in the 1950s, and then was translated and became more well-known in the 1960s. And he was the one who argued that the image of the future that exists in a civilization or a culture, and if you bring it down even in an organization, influences what that culture is. And if you change that image, then things begin to happen differently in the current world. And that really sort of kicked off, I think, the whole future studies field. And then there were associations that were formed, and it became a field of academic study. which then actually flourished in the 70s into the early 1980s. It has since actually faded somewhat as the pace of change speeded up. Then people said, you can't predict the future anyway, so just try to take care of today's world and the future will take care of itself. So it's actually fallen back a little bit.
So if you look at the 60s, it seems that two of the prominent names that really started to address this notion of the future study, really future wisdom that one needed to be able to develop, was a combination of both Alvin Toffler and Edward Lindemann.
They were two big influences on me. Alvin Toffler, of course, very famous initially for his book, The Future Shock, in 1971.
And that popularized the field of study.
Yeah. And his argument was that we were now in a pace of change that psychologically we couldn't keep up with it, and so that people were experiencing future shock. That was the simple argument. The most shocking thing about the book, by the way, was that he didn't say anything about the computer revolution because he didn't know about the invention of the microprocessor. So the next book that he wrote after Future Shock was all about how computer networks were going to change the world as he tried to catch up with that. But he, that book in the U.S. at least really swept college campuses and became a kind of seminal event.
When you were a student, what triggered your interest in the study of the future? What was it that acted as a stimulus for you intellectually and professionally to really focus in on studying the future?
Well, Toffler's book happened to come out when I was a college senior, so that was important. And in that same year, the college at which I was a student had hired as its president this guy named Ed Lindemann, who had come straight to the college from the Apollo spacecraft program, where he'd been director of program planning for building Apollo. And so he was a futurist. He had written a book called Space: A New Direction for Mankind. He wrote another book called Thinking in the Future Tense, and believed that the future was a choice that we made. It wasn't something that just happens to us, as you mentioned in your introduction. And so he just became a mentor, right out of classic mentorship literature. When I was a college senior, things began appearing in my mailbox from Ed Lindemann saying, here's an article you should read, or I'm going to be giving a presentation downtown at such and such a time, why don't you come along? That kind of relationship kind of developed. And I have a personality that's interested in the future. If you do personality profiles, that'll show up. And so it all kind of came together then. I went off into higher education, stayed in higher education for a decade or actually a decade and a half, and then went full-time into this future studies field.
So the whole notion of future planning and future wisdom and future knowledge, this is not, it's a three-stage process, because what you're effectively trying to do is you're trying to develop foresight.
Yes.
You're trying to anticipate what developments might apply across various fields that might intersect or not, as the case might be.
Yeah, I make the case in the book that almost all organizations engage in what they call strategic planning, but the strategic planning as typically practiced is kind of an oxymoron in that it's not very strategic because it's not long-term enough to be very strategic, and it's not very effective planning because the planning itself is too long-term and not short-term enough. And so I make the case that that good planning has three phases. There's a foresight phase in which you really try to look, you go ahead longer term than you usually do, i.e. that decade or two, not because you're going to figure out accurately what it's going to look like, but because you're trying to stimulate some creativity.
So let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Today, in most major metropolitan areas, we have significant problems about traffic volume.
Yes. Yeah.
So if one is looking in terms of the study of the future, you would then have to try and project the implications of mass transportation 20 years from now?
Yeah. Well, and you try to, I've spent a lot of time around transportation planners in the last couple of years. I worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation on a 50-year vision for transportation, and then with the Federal Highway Administration identifying long-term research agendas, sort of what should we be researching in order to make some breakthroughs in transportation. So it's a field that's of interest to me at this moment.
Now, if you're looking at 50 years, though, some people can't even determine what they're going to be doing tomorrow at lunchtime.
Well, they can, but in fact, strangely enough, it's easier in some ways to see what's going to be happening 50 years from now than it is to see what's happening at lunchtime tomorrow.
How is that possible?
Well, because population trends are relatively predictable because they're very large patterns.
Right.
You can look you can look at energy consumption patterns and energy availability, what's going to happen with oil depletion and so on.
And this is all looking retrospectively, of course.
Well, you can look retrospectively, but based on that analysis, you can see that it's either 50 years from now, either oil will be incredibly expensive, or it will not be being used for transportation at all. Well, if you look at the day after tomorrow, you can say, well, we don't need to change anything. Sure, gas is a little bit more expensive, and sure, we might run out of oil someday, but 50 years from now, you know for sure you're going to be out of oil. So then you have to ask, well, what does that mean we ought to be doing in the next 5 years? Well, maybe we ought to start looking at alternatives that would sustain a transportation system so that we're ready sooner rather than later. That's the advantage of the long-term view.
So if you say that there are 3 stages to foresight,
Yeah.
or futuring, as you
Yeah,
have
to
referred to it
futuring,
in
yeah.
your book, what are those 3 stages?
So the first stage is trying to accomplish or achieve some foresight, which is what's going to be different, what are the disruptive changes that we're going to see, what are some long-term trends that might actually hold, to try to see outside and longer term, outside the boundaries of what you usually see and longer term than you usually do. That's the foresight or anticipatory stage. Stage 2 is a decision-making stage, which is, so what directions do we need to go in? You can label it, at the end of the day, you can label it a vision, you can label it a mission, you can label it goals, you can label it strategies, all kinds of language that you can use. But you're trying to make a decision about, we're here today and we want to head in this direction. So it's a decision-making stage. And then the
which
third,
your foresight gives you, because
Which the
you've
foresight-
done your analytical processing.
right, and people often make those choices on too short a time horizon because their foresight has been too short-term, and so they miss things. I'll give you a couple of examples in a
Yes.
second. And then the third stage is what I call the planning stage, and that, I think, it needs to be very short-term because the world does change very quickly. And so you need to, I actually argue to organizations that you ought not probably to have plans that are more than about 6 months long. Maybe as much as 12 months or 18 months, but never longer than that, because sometime in the next 6 to 18 months, something's going to happen that's going to throw you off base anyway. And so engage in long-term foresight, sort of medium-term strategic decision-making, and then very short-term planning. That's, all organized around being very flexible, so that you can move quickly, so that you can change your decision. Here's an example that I like a lot. And I cite it in the book, and I often talk about it when I'm making presentations. 1993, Fortune magazine did this great cover. And on the cover were 3 dinosaur shapes. And each dinosaur had a name. And the names were Sears and IBM and General Motors. And in 93, Fortune was asking, have these 3 companies become dinosaurs in danger of going extinct? 30 years earlier, Peter Drucker had named the 3 best managed companies in the history of the world, and their names were Sears, IBM, and General Motors. 30 years later, they're in danger of going under. Now they've all been working real hard not to be dinosaurs since. What happened? IBM had a picture in their mind of the future of computing. And they were wrong. And General Motors, actually, there's a classic early 1970s, 12 or so, I think it is, strategic principles from some strategic exercise that General Motors went through in about 72, 73. And one of the principles was the Japanese will never have more than 4 or 5% of the US automobile market. So they had an image of the future of the automobile business that was just completely wrong, because they were sort of stuck in the past, not thinking long-term enough. And Sears, the same thing in terms of retailing. If you take that long-term view, you have a better chance of seeing something changing. Take digital media, take the music business. You have the digital media companies, you have the classic music producing companies, not really looking, if you look out, not at the internet of today, wild and crazy though it is already in terms of what it's done to the music industry. If you look at 10 years or even 20 years and what's going to be happening with technology, the speeds that will be 1,000 times faster than today's speeds, the fact that we'll have devices, probably invisible, but certainly wearable, that have storage capacity and communication capacity thousands of times beyond today's devices. And you'll have a generation It'll be the second generation that's grown up. But now we talk about the dot-com generation or the millennial generation or the digital native generation as the first generation to grow up in this internet-based world. But now the kids being born in this century, since 2000, will have grown up in this high bandwidth.
High bandwidth and rapid change.
And rapid change world, and they will be the 20-somethings, 15 years from now. And so if you were in a music company, you'd say, this world is inevitable. So the sooner we position ourselves to exist in that world, the more advantage we're going to have, the more likely it is we won't end up on the cover of Fortune magazine pictured like a dinosaur.
And when you mentioned those dinosaurs, something that seemed to be completely counterintuitive, just hearing you articulate this, is with the resources that a General Motors or an IBM has, and considering their preeminence, particularly IBM, how could they have made such a fundamental wrong turn?
Well,
does this happen in large structures?
It happens. It happens all the time. I mean, I think the numbers. I just saw these the other day. That if you look at what would be the equivalent of the Fortune 100 globally in 1900, by 2000, I think it was 29 of them still existed, and the rest of them were gone. Yeah.
Natural attrition.
That's the history of big organizations. You run into big bureaucracy, but especially what you run into is lots of people in General Motors or in IBM or in any large market-dominant organization. You have lots of people saying, hey, wait a minute, the world's going over here. And everybody else says, oh yeah, but we're too busy. Oh yeah, but we've got a lot of investment in the way we're doing it now. Let's make sure we use up that investment, and we'll have time to change when the time is right. But then suddenly the time isn't right anymore, and they've sort of missed the window, and so then they end up catching up. It's just sort of the nature of very large organizations. I'm from the Seattle area where Microsoft is, and Bill Gates and his people have been hyper aware of this. They used to talk about this when the company was founded all the time. How could they avoid, as they got as large as they are, could they? In fact, the question was, could they avoid that same syndrome? And now you have people saying, no, they haven't avoided it very well, and other people saying, well, they've done a better job than most of sort of avoiding getting stuck in their current paradigm and refusing, even though people in the company can see the new paradigm, everybody else refuses it. Not to go too long, but I just did a presentation for a very large insurance company, and they wanted to know about the millennial generation or the digital native generation and how they were going to change the workforce. That was among their questions.
And this is all in the foresight stage?
Yeah, it's all in the foresight stage. So I often get invited in because I can push people beyond their normal time boundaries into a longer term future. So I did this presentation, and people said, oh, that was really, the CEO came up and said, that was really, really interesting. And she said, I have just lots of senior people in my company who are saying, well, this all might be true, but don't do anything until we retire. Just wait. We've only got 3 more years and then we're gone. Then go ahead and change the company.
But that's because of the resistance to change that's a natural human function.
Yeah, it is. And so, that's a very hard dynamic to overcome.
Particularly in a larger structure.
Yeah.
I was thinking particularly of an example as you were relating the IBM and General Motors example of Kodak. With the disappearance of film and being replaced by digital cameras, who would have thought that a titan of American business could have gone through such an extraordinary apotheosis as Kodak?
It's so hard it's just hard when you're in that position of dominance to believe that the world can change that fundamentally. I happen to have a good friend who was the director of a virtual reality lab, who was he had a consulting contract with Kodak. I don't know that I would say he was the key consultant or a key consultant, but he had a contract with them. And I became aware of this maybe a decade ago, that he was working with them. And he would come back and he would be frustrated because he would say, I'm working with people who are trying to convince everybody else in the company that the world is changing. But most of the people in the company are saying, well, I don't think it's really going to work out. I think that digital stuff is going to be a big fad. How can people organize all those pictures? And film's got a ways to run yet. And so it's the natural process in those kinds of organizations. And he couldn't, I'm sure there were other people trying to make that same kind of conceptual breakthrough in the company. It's very hard to do. I would say It's certainly historically more rare that people kind of leap ahead of that curve who are entrenched in the old way of doing things than who don't, who stick with the old way too long.
So don't you believe that something like Moore's law, which stated the fact that every 18 months computer capacity is going to double, this kind of foresight, and particularly the environment of change with things moving so much faster, is this not making both governments, corporations and individuals be aware of the need for change and also the importance of foresight and planning and the constructs?
What I observed now, a little bit about my history. I was in higher education until 1987. So now this is 2007.
Right.
So 2 decades of this full-time futuring work. So I've been around a lot of organizations from just as the internet was beginning and prior to the World Wide Web, and until now. And so I've seen this in the early 90s when I was really starting this. People were very excited about long-term planning. Partly it was anticipating the 21st century, and we ought to ask, what's the 21st century going to look like? Then the web hit, and then people began talking about web time, and people began saying, the world is changing too fast, and planning is obsolete. And so what actually happened was rather than...
because the traditional planning cycle would be much longer and wouldn't rely on disruptive mechanisms.
Even a 3-year strategic planning cycle was too long. And so, as you know, the mantra became flexibility and just doing things just in time. And the idea was, let's just adjust day by day. And part of this was because an awful lot of late 1990s, internet entrepreneurs were interviewed, and they were asked, well, so what's your planning process? And they would laugh, and they would say, planning process, we just come in every day and try to keep up. And so people began to say, well, maybe that's the way you ought to run a business, is you don't worry about what happened yesterday, and you don't worry about what's going to happen day after tomorrow. You just come in and you keep up with whatever's happening today and let things take care of itself. But Alvin Toffler, the starter of the whole thing, wrote only about 3 years ago, he said, a lack of a strategy is fine if you don't care where you're going. And it's true that flexibility will keep you alive for a while, but you still will never really get where you might want to go if you don't have some idea. Just to give you one more example, Bill Gates was often cited as somebody who didn't have a strategic plan. And they didn't engage in company strategic planning retreats and didn't have big meetings that were formally identified as the day we create the vision for Microsoft. And so people would often to me say, well, just look at Microsoft. They don't have a vision. They just sort of watch what's happening in the world. They see a good idea. They grab that idea. They either buy it or they recreate it, and they outperform everybody else faster. But I tell this story in the book. It was about 1989, I got invited to sit for 3 hours one evening. It was one of the really key fun experiences of my life, for 3 hours in front of 100 high school students who were in a summer leadership program. And the person who was running the program happened to know Bill Gates, and he happened to know me. I didn't know Bill Gates at the time. And he said, I want the two of you to come and sit and talk about the future. And Glenn, you can talk about the sort of large global scale future, and Bill's going to talk about the future of technology. And I had never met Bill Gates, and I knew what Microsoft was. I was still using a computer based on a operating system called CP/M. I don't know if you remember that one. But anyway, so we sat in front of these other high school kids on 2 stools for 3 hours, talking about and answering questions about the future. And Gates said, look, he said, at Microsoft, we know that we can't forecast exactly what technology is going to be like more than maybe 36 months in advance. This was 1989 or so. So he said, I can't tell you what the computing world is going to look like in 2001. But he said, let me tell you what I imagine. And then he described digital pictures on his wall that he could speak to, and they would change into some other artist. And he described kind of virtual reality-based booths that you would sit in and have kind of full immersive kind of conversations with programmed personalities, and he described a networked world very similar to what we got. So he described a world which is maybe 75% come to pass, and 25% that hasn't yet come to pass and may never. But I've always remembered that story when people say, well, just look at them. They never bothered with trying to create a vision. They just sort of were flexible and acted fast. But I thought, no, the guy who founded that company had a real, and still has, a constantly evolving vision 10 years ahead of what he thinks the world could look like, should look like. And then he tries to stimulate his people to, let's do some research. Let's ask, what if, let's suppose that was the dream. Could that be possible? How would we do it? What kind of inventions would we need to make in order for, let's say, an immersive booth that you could sit in and feel like you were walking in the Grand Canyon? What would it take to do that? We can't do that today, but maybe in 10 years we can. What would be the interim steps? That's the way they work.
So Glenn, it seems to me then that imagination is one of the key building blocks.
Yeah.
Because if you can try and just project some kind of Imagineering, for want of a better word, which is really one of the Disney company have a whole Imagineering group.
Yeah.
You first have to have a sense of imagination, marry that to your trinity of strategic planning objectives.
Yeah.
So give us a few examples of where you're looking 25 years out in a world today where things move so fast. When the first mobile phone, as an example, came out some 15 years ago, many people referred to it as a brick because you needed a special case to carry it.
I owned a brick. Yeah.
You owned a brick?
Oh, yeah.
Now, who would have thought that today you have 3 billion users, or similarly, that television could now be fragmented into 1,000 channels rather than just 3 terrestrial channels? How do you build that into future planning and future thinking and Imagineering?
Let me say a couple of things about that. By the way, I was on the board of a virtual reality startup company in the mid-90s, and when we went bankrupt because it was too expensive to do virtual reality, and we were about 15 years too soon.
Right.
Our key programmer went to Imagineering, went down to Disney and got a job with Imagineering. But in fact, all of those things have been foreseen for years. I remember, I can remember in the 1970s sitting with this space guy who was this mentor in a seminar that he was teaching. And he said, this is probably about 1976. He said, there's going to come a time when your telephone, your television, your radio, your record player, he called it a record player, your record player are all going to become one device.
And this was 30 years ago.
Yeah, this was 30 years ago. Sometime later, I was reading an old novel by Arthur C. Clarke, which was written in about 1971 or 72. And in it, he has a character take out something that essentially is exactly like a PDA. At the time, I thought of it as kind of like a Palm Pilot, but now it's more like an iPhone or something like that, and use that device. I saw the director of research. I was making a presentation at Microsoft to a group of customers as part of a program, and the director of research at Microsoft was also making a presentation, and he put up a slide that had 6 or so technologies from Star Trek. And he said, now you might think this is kind of silly, but here's how this technology is becoming real, and here's how this one's becoming real, and here's how we're moving in that direction, and so on. So imagination, strangely enough, often comes from the world of fiction.
And so consequently, science fiction, as you said in your book, plays an important role in just determining some of the pathways to the future.
Yeah, to be honest, most professional futurists that I know stay at arm's length from science fiction because they don't want to be seen as not serious. They say, no, this is a science.
Not fiction.
We can make, but it's not fiction. We can make real forecasts, we can make real plans, but there are some science fiction writers whom I've gotten to know and others who I've only read, who, if you want to understand, for example, what the media world of 2025 is going to look like, read I'm going to blank on his name now. The book is called Rainbow's End, and the author's name is Vernor Vinge, and it's San Diego 2025, and it's all around junior high age kids, and what the global network looks like at that time and how that enables them to be global actors. I will bet you that 90% of what this science fiction writer, who is actually a math professor by profession, what he describes is exactly what's going to happen. Now, you won't find it in futurist forecasts. You won't find it in business books. You'll find it in a science fiction book. And you'll say, if I'm in a computing company, I'm in a software company, I'm in a digital media company, I'd be looking at that and say, we could actually make that real. We could be the first to actually begin moving in that direction. So it's one great source, I think, for imagination that I suggest. I always give people a list of science fiction books they ought to read if they want to get some ideas that are sort of outside the way we usually think.
Now, Glenn, do you think that the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, were futurists in being able to cognite very early on that search was going to become probably one of the most important highways of thinking
Yes.
in the
Yes.
21st century?
Yes. Now, they in truth, they had some examples in front of them. There were already some early search engines and so on. And I couldn't technically describe what they did that was so much better in terms of search, but whatever it was a better search technology. But they also, I think, just intuited that we would soon be in a world, because the internet was already suggesting that this was true, in which virtually every activity begins with a search. And especially for the millennials or the digital natives, that's true. There just isn't anything that they do that doesn't start with a search. And they intuited that that would be true. I'm sure, not having talked to them as you may have, that they themselves are surprised at how big and how fast how fast it grew. But there's another thing that you can do looking historically, which is you can look at the uptake of radio, and then you can look at the uptake of television, the uptake of cell phones, and so on, and you see these adoption curves from 10% of the population to 50% of the population owning these things getting shorter and shorter. And in an instant communication, instant travel world, that's only going to continue. And so
the global electronic village.
Each new idea is going to be taken up more quickly, adopted more quickly, probably have a shorter lifestyle. There's another author. There's a Japanese philosopher, historian. His name is Yonji Masuda, and he wrote a book in Japan in 1986 called The Knowledge Value Revolution. Then it was translated in about 1990 here in the U.S. And he saw the same thing coming. And so the important thing is to have your antenna out. The problem with most people in business, and we all know this, is that it's an old Peter Drucker phrase, the urgent crowds out the important. That if you don't look up and look around and don't carve out some time to do that, you miss the signals. You stay flexible and you stay, you sort of keep up with the day-to-day crises, but you don't really see that conceptual breakthrough because you don't take time to look up and look out.
So if you look at these bits of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
expanded, accelerated knowledge, bits of intelligence, it also shows the dominance of IT.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
are the main IT trends that you are seeing over the next 10 to 15, 20 years?
Well, I summarized several in the book. One is, obviously, some of these are self-evident, ubiquitous, but much higher ubiquitous bandwidth is also much higher speed. So that, we're still fairly early, strangely enough, in the global adoption or the global spread of very high bandwidth. There's, the U.S. ranks kind of low on that scale. We're 13th, somewhere between 13th and 17th on availability of high bandwidth.
Which country is dominant? Which is
Korea, Singapore. There are some European countries that are much better, Northern European, France, and so on, that have, relatively inexpensive, much higher bandwidth.
But clearly, this is a key.
But this is
a key signpost to the future.
Yeah. So that is clearly one. The emergence of so-called grid computing, where every device is connected into every other device, and so that you can actually do things as...
Which is essentially what is now present.
Yeah.
Where is that particular aspect of grid computing going in 10 years' time?
Well, as individual devices, both fixed and portable devices themselves, become more powerful, as according to Moore's law, which just continues and continues, and what's his name, Ray Kurzweil, the singularity guy, makes the case that Moore's law is actually likely to continue infinitely into the future. It isn't going to come to an end because of some silicon limit. There's other ways
But
around
Vint
that.
Cerf has also demonstrated.
They're saying that's going to go on. So individual device, individual nodes will ever become more powerful. The bandwidth between them will become more robust, and therefore it'll be possible for these devices in their spare time to be doing things together if we give them permission to do that. And so that means we'll do larger computing kinds of problems and so on. So that's interesting.
Grid computing.
That's an interesting one. Another one that intrigues me a lot, and there's been some recent speculation about this, is the emergence of massively multiplayer online role-playing games, which I don't really play, but I've stood over the shoulder and watched millennial generation kids play, and it's really pretty dazzling to watch them play World of Warcraft and be connected auditorially and through their visual devices with people all over the world playing this game. But now there's talk about applying that to business problems, to real sales issues, sales kinds of situations. For example, I've heard of, but I haven't been to their site in Second Life of an advertising agency in New York that has client meetings in Second Life. So people from all over the world send their avatars, and then they operate their avatars, and they actually have their serious business meeting in Second Life. Well, when you get the bandwidth built out and the devices become more popular and more robust, then you can overlay a Second Life or a World of Warcraft or an immersive game-like environment onto the real world, kind of like a Google Maps or a satellite imagery kind of environment, and you can create a true three-dimensional web. And so there is some speculation now that if you go out 5 or 10 years, the web itself, when you're on the web, you will be immersed in a three-dimensional environment, some of which will be fiction and others will be a perfect analog of today's world. And I remember the founder of this virtual reality club or a company that I was part of in the 90s, used to forecast at that time that there would come a day when I would be here in this live conversation with you, and at the same time, an avatar that looks exactly like me and sounds exactly like me and is programmed sufficiently with the things that I say is in Singapore having a conversation with an interviewer there simultaneously. So I've said, sure, I can take that interview at Singapore, even though I have to be here live with Bruce, but I'll have my avatar do that one. They might not even know the difference. It might actually be the avatar of the interviewer who is interviewing me, and so I could be doing these multiple things simultaneously.
Science fiction turned into reality.
Yeah, and that still sounds fairly far-fetched, but look at Moore's law, look at the ubiquitous bandwidth, look at massively multiplayer online these games and so on, and then step out 10 years. So you say, well, I don't know if that's really going to happen in 10 years, but let's suppose that that's an attractive world. What would we do in our company to move toward that or make it more likely?
So would a good example of one of these IT stanchions be the whole notion of GPS and what GPS has done?
Yeah.
Because from what was essentially a satellite technology has now developed into navigation systems in cars and location-based services for wireless devices.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the other IT trends that I talk about.
Yes.
And there
what is that trend?
Well, the connection of RFID,
Which is what?
radio frequency devices, tiny little devices that replace barcodes that are attached to everything that's made, every product, and that then send little radio signals to receivers that then go into the global network so that the manufacturer of every device knows where every device is. The advantage for you and me is that if our keys have a radio frequency RFID chip in it, then we should be able to look at our cell phone and identify in the house where we've put the keys because we can see it on the map because it's sending a signal. So that's a nice simple one.
So this is the natural evolution of a certain technological path.
So that clearly is happening, but then our computing devices, unfortunately not my iPhone, this is one of the oversights, and I'm not quite sure why they didn't put a GPS locator in it. I presume, well, it's partly because you can tell where you are on the cell phone grid anyway, but you assume that everybody will have a location-aware device that they're either wearing or carrying in the relatively near future. And so then the network can see where you are, where that device is, and give you messages relevant to that location. And you know, there are all kinds of things that are nice. One of the ones we use all the time is the Starbucks locator. So, whenever we go somewhere, my wife and I, particularly if it's in the morning, we like to know where the 5 nearest Starbucks are.
You want to join the Caffeine Academy as quickly as possible.
We do. And we happen to really like that particular coffee, partly because we got to meet Howard and all of that stuff. And
That's Howard Schultz, the chairman and founder
Schultz,
of Starbucks.
Yeah. So, you know, and that's a nice example of a location-aware device. I ought to be able to pick up my phone, and many phones can do this. The phone knows where it is, Starbucks knows where the phone is, and I just have to maybe even hit a single button, and it says, okay, here are the 5 nearest, and here's how you get to the nearest one. That's the world of, that's actually not the, of course, 20-year future, that's the 5-year future, or even 3-year future. And so location-aware services is another major IT trend that Moore's Law makes possible.
What about biometrics? There's a lot of talk about biometrics, particularly in a much more security conscious environment.
Yeah, I've noticed that they've been working on this $100 laptop computer that they want to bring to the third world.
Right, that's the MIT Nick Negroponte.
Negroponte. There's another group.
Google also doing something like that.
Yeah, Google. There's about 3 different groups that are trying to come up with a $100 computer that would be rugged, but I've noticed that they've built in a fingerprint device so that you could make it ID secure if you wanted to, which is interesting to me.
So then give me some kind of idea of fingerprint technology, biometrics, 15, 20 years' time. What are we going to use biometrics for as a futurist?
Well, we'll certainly use it for any kind of security system. So, you know, when your door, I worked on a television program, a pilot for a guy named Stephen Bochco.
The creator of Miami Vice.
Yeah, well, he was the creator of NYPD Blue. And so we did a pilot, which did not get picked up, but it was called NYPD 2069.
2069.
So the idea was New York Police Force, the year's 2069. And you know, the very first question that the writers asked me as the technical advisor was, scene 1, character walks up to the front door in Queens of this house. What's the front door look like? Is there a door handle? Is there a biometric device? And so on. So that was a very interesting question.
How do you creatively think about what a door is going to look like in 80 years from now?
Well, that was an interesting challenge because when I'm working, let's say with a company, even like a Microsoft, all we have to say is, well, 80 years from now, life will be pretty amazing. But when you're making a television show, you have to say, okay, the door looks like this, and it has this kind of handle. So we had, you know, eye scanning devices, iris scanning devices, and we had fingerprint devices everywhere, and that seems quite, you know, in today's security-based world, and it's also a convenience, because the computing power to tell whether this is your face or your voice or your iris or your fingerprint becomes so cheap because of Moore's Law. Then I think everywhere now that you see keys that are made out of metal, those will all be gone in 15 or 20 years. It'll take a while to phase all that old stuff out, and everything will be biometrically.
Does this also mean that there's going to be increased usage of nanotechnology, much, much smaller?
This is an interesting debate in terms of this sort of 4 legs of a stool, the technologies which are really driving our world today: robotics, biotechnology, information technology, and nanotechnology. Which one really is the most important in shaping future life? The one that has the biggest potential, I think. You can make an argument about biotechnology because it could enable us to live so long, or to change to sort of speed up evolution, and that, of course, is a whole interesting subject. But nanotechnology, this ability to get inside of the atomic structure of matter and then to reshape matter at that scale. I mean, we've always reshaped matter by hacking away at it or by melting it and so on, but if you can actually chemically or mechanically grab individual molecules and move them around, then you can make things that not only are very small, you can also make things that are very big, like an elevator to space, but you can make things that are very small, but you can change the physical properties so that it does things that otherwise has never existed before.
Give us an example of how you would try and use your foresight to just visualize what that might be.
So you can make something for example, that conducts, made out of carbon nanotubes that conducts electricity, that's very tiny, it can take, and then you spray this onto a plastic substrate. The plastic looks like that kind of clear plastic you might have used in an old overhead projector. So you spray this material on there, and now it might be a solar cell, which is actually, of course, a major area of research. But it can also be what's called a phased array antenna. And if you go to an Aegis destroyer, you've got these large phased array antennas that can see over the horizon, and they cost about $1 million per square meter. But if you spray this nano material onto this plastic substrate, you can make it for about $100 per square meter. And so then you can put one on your backpack and have an antenna that sees over the horizon. And it's because the physical properties of these elements by themselves, when combined in this unique way, because you can do things at this molecular scale that we formerly couldn't do, this is only a decade and a half old that we can work at this scale, suddenly you discover, well, it's got this property that we didn't know was there. One other example, there's a company that's based in Reno, Nevada. It's called Altair Nano.
Altair Nano.
Altair Nano, very exciting company. Fascinating company because they've been in existence, a publicly owned company, been in existence for 30 years, and they came out of they were a spin-off of a mining company because they discovered how to process a certain kind of, see if I can get the chemicals right, titanium, and that made a very good component for paint. But they didn't think of themselves as a nanotechnology company.
For paint?
Yeah, for paint. So it makes it a better kind of paint.
Right.
Okay. Then with the ability in the last 15, 20 years to see into the molecular structure of this matter, they discovered that this particular lithium titanate, it's called, forms these little perfect spheres that mean that electrons can flow between them over much shorter distances because they can pack them in a different way than the rather sort of random crystalline structure. Then somebody figured out that, well, you could replace the positive pole in a battery with this lithium titanate, and suddenly you have a much more efficient battery. So now they've renamed themselves Altair Nano, and they're making this nanotechnology material, one of the uses of which is to put in a battery. So I visited them, and it's kind of like walking into a science fiction place. It's, on one hand, it just looks like a bunch of vats.
In Reno, Nevada.
In Reno, Nevada. And at the bottom of the vat are these bags, and into the bags flows, after this very complex chemical process, this powder, that each of which is a tiny nano-sized sphere of lithium titanate. Okay. Now, when applied to batteries, it means to a, what's the kind of battery in a laptop? Lithium-ion battery. So you change one of the poles in there, and now your laptop battery will last for how long? About 2 years, because you can recharge a laptop battery about 500 or 600 times before it's worn out its ability to be recharged.
Right.
Their tests show that their batteries can be recharged 15,000 times. They'll recharge in less than a minute. So
it completely upends the entire concept of battery.
They have built a bank of these that can run an automobile. I've driven the automobile, and you can recharge them 15,000 times, so that the battery pack would last for somewhere between 10 and 15 years. So you're not going to have to replace the battery necessarily in the lifetime of the car. And if you use a 220 large-scale system for recharging the battery, the car will go 200 to 300 miles on a charge and will recharge in 4 minutes.
So Glenn, here you are tickling the tentacles of the future. As a futurist who can see where a pathway is going, and you look at the future, are you optimistic or do you see an apocalypse?
Either one is possible. I used to think of myself as kind of wildly optimistic and kind of naturally optimistic. I do have a sense of some natural optimism, but you have to be sort of more grittily, determinedly optimistic in these days because the dangers are very great. There's no doubt that if you look at things that could really threaten us, from global pandemics to global warming that really gets over a tipping point and gets out of control, to obviously random acts of terrorism and so on, it's hard to be just Pollyanna-ish But at the same time, there's the opportunities to invent, to connect globally, to do things in new ways have never been any greater than they are today. And so it's all a matter of what kind of future do we want? And so I spend my time going around to people trying to encourage them to ask that question. What kind of future do we want, given all the possibilities, and how can we move in that direction, and encouraging that to be a positive direction?
And in doing so, it makes studying the future not so much a mystery, but really thinking about imaginative foresight and then the application of effective strategic planning that can carry that imagination into some kind of reality.
It's both. People have the impression, and there are some people who make their livings trying to do accurate forecasts. I think they're interesting to pay attention to. Everybody knows there's a limit to how accurate any forecast can be. So the question is, you try to understand the future context, and then you ask two things. What does that future context tell us we ought to be getting ready for, or preparing for, or learning about? And second, what direction do we really want to go, and what does that tell us about what we ought to be doing in the near term? And from that, the future creates the present.
So as Benjamin Disraeli, the famous British Prime Minister from 150 years ago said, information is power, but in today's modern environment, knowledge and future knowledge is even greater power.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Glenn, thank you very much for being part of Future Talks. And Glenn's book, Turning the Future into Revenue, has some very, very interesting insights that would certainly be beneficial to anyone watching this particular program. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Heemstra and Gerd Leonhard, and today we're talking about media megatrends. So guys, what are the megatrends, Gerd?
Well, megatrends are things that are happening in society, technology, and in culture at large that are impacting media. And there's quite a few. But one of the most obvious ones is that what used to be a scarcity business based on availability.
Scarcity, right?
Yeah, scarcity business in terms of making stuff available and having things in stores. In media, for example, movies or CDs, is now becoming a ubiquity business, meaning that the more you're present in digital networks like mobile networks, online stores, social communities, the more money you can make with being ubiquitous. So the big shift is basically saying the product-based business, which was based on scarcity and on shelf space, is now moving to being part of it. That's how you're going to make money, which is a completely different paradigm of how you value content.
Glenn, what do you see as another media megatrend?
If you think of a trend that's going to impact media, Gerd and I both talk about the generation that are young people today. It's kind of odd for three of us our age to be talking about the future of media because kids growing up today, which we both refer to as digital natives, sometimes they're called millennials, sometimes they're called .com generation, they are the first to grow up in this get music by clicking, buy a CD, can't even define what a CD is, and that kind of world. And so,
and they don't read newspapers.
And they don't read newspapers, but developing a media package that will serve them when this is the only world that they know, I think is new. There's one other external kind of population-based trend, and that's the aging of the baby boomers worldwide. And I think that has some interesting implications for media companies as well, because it'll be the first, I think, generations heavily steeped in music to age into their old age. And so the question of what kind of music they'll consume or what kind of media they'll consume and how they'll consume it as they get into their 60s, 70s, and even 80s is another really interesting mega trend, the results of which I think will play out and are interesting to think about.
There's the angle there as well that goes right with this, is the idea of who actually makes a program. It's like I program my own media by clicking now. Right? So these kids who are on mobile devices by and large, that used to be called computers. Right? Now they're completely converged mobile devices, and Nokia is becoming a computer company essentially, right? That also makes phone calls, right? So now we have these devices that allow people to essentially determine programs by clicking, or by sharing programs by essentially connecting with a buddy and saying, give me his likings, his tastes, through a link, through metadata. This used to be called programming in television, right? And only a few privileged people were allowed to do it, right? Because they supposedly, and they still do, have the skills, right? So now those people aren't being replaced, but they're being sort of paralleled, right? This is like the bloggers and the professional guys at the New York Times. This is the same thing, right? They're not going to be losing their value, but they're being paralleled by these people who also have value, right? How does that impact them? Well, I would say that within 10 years, we'll have thousands of people who are virtual tastemakers, just like people who are professional reviewers on Amazon.
Like citizen
millions,
journalists.
millions of
Wikipedia,
them,
right?
Yeah.
It's this whole thing. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing it for standing, some sort of credit system, some social standing. And then eventually maybe they can make a business of it, just like the reviewer on Amazon becomes a person that works for a publishing company.
I was going to say there is a technological trend that Gerd just referred to, and that the whole convergence thing, which we've heard about forever and ever. But I'll just give you a quick example. I bought my iPhone, brought it to my office where my office assistant is from the millennial generation. And she said, wow, this is the only computer I need. She said if it had a projector in it so that I could project my music videos, and if it had a projectable keyboard, I don't need any other device than this. This is everything that I need right here. And of course, if you look at what's happening in the technology labs, these devices are going to have little projectors so that you can show wall-size videos, and they're going to have projectable keyboards. And so that device is really going to achieve the convergence that everybody has anticipated for 20 or 30 years. Now it truly is on the horizon and opens up lots of possibilities for media companies to think about what they deliver, how they deliver it.
And let's think about how these prices are dropping for these devices and what that means for so-called third world or underdeveloped countries. Basically, at a certain point, this device is going to be free, right? And why will it be free? Because simply the networks operating with this device will give it to people to have more value on the network, right? So just like the $100 computer is going to result in a lot of business for associated areas, it's cheaper to give them the computer, right? I mean, why would I be a company like Vodafone or Orange and not pay for the music to be in the network when I'm spending $400 to acquire a customer to be on the network in the first place? I may as well pay for his music. So here we have a complete shift also of the copyright paradigm, right? Because it used to be that you would say, well, if you make a copy, it costs you more than to watch it. Right? And this is completely gone, right? This is a mega trend that we're seeing absolutely everywhere. The access to this content, be it on my wristwatch or on the screen or on any sort of mobile device, is almost replacing the idea of a copy, right? So the whole copyright community is moving towards a usage right, which is a license, a new type of license. And I think this is a fantastic development for the copyright owners, because being paid for access and also bundling it into other services and upselling and getting data back, right, means I get cut into the value chain everywhere. I don't just get to sell little pieces of plastic, which obviously don't scale and cost too much.
Glenn, give us your view on any trends you see with newspapers and the future of newspapers.
Newspapers are a very complicated story, and newspaper people ask me all the time where they're going. There will always be a desire for news. So the only question is who produces that content and how is it consumed. Quite clearly, paper itself is going to disappear, although it's still a gradual process. Everything takes, in that kind of transition, seems to take a lot longer than people would have imagined. The challenge of news organizations as they exist now is the users as news producers can do it so much more cheaply than paid news people. And I don't really know how they're going to work that out, of how large the professional news cadre can stay in the face of really volunteer but very high quality news gatherers who can either for free or for very small payments put stuff up. So we will see sort of international news organizations, I think, shrink. And I'm not all in favor of that. I don't think that's a great thing. In fact, I think one of the 24/7 news thing has done as much harm to society as it has helped things because of kind of what it's done to values about what's important and so on. But the newspapers themselves they're on a downward trend, and I don't see anywhere out of that for them. What do you think, Eric?
Newspapers, simply speaking, I think they will become multimedia companies as well. I mean, the New York Times is pretty much on the way to that, right? Now Walter Mossberg has videos. Right?
Walter Mossberg from the Wall Street Journal.
Sorry, yeah. I meant the other guy who's doing the digital thing at the New York Times. Essentially, now all these medias, radio guys are becoming TV guys as well, because radio stations are now making movies as well and offering that kind of content. And newspaper organizations will add video as a default. I mean, that's going to be a total standard, right? So now you have text feeds, showing up on your reader or something. You will have video feeds, which are basically television, right? So this complete convergence of this is just a question to me, as in terms of the positioning of these companies, a question of trust. Who do I really trust?
That's exactly right. Because so what the crossover point between the professionals who are working for one of these now multimedia companies versus, let's say, somebody who started a blog but now has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people a day coming to that blog, have they become a professional, a news person, or are they still an amateur, even though they're making lots of money because advertisers are pouring money into their blog? Are they now a professional journalist? That debate, I think, is one there'll be a lot of fights about that over the next half a dozen to a dozen years. And as it plays out, sort of who gets trusted and who doesn't get trusted will become the issue. And people have been talking a lot about how the web is going to be so much based on trustworthiness as the criteria for whether you're worth listening to or worth paying attention to.
What do you think about the notion of local content? Do you think that that's going to become more and more pertinent? Localized content? People's local environments?
I do. I think absolutely, because the tools are going to be cheaper, as Gerd pointed out. People who have not had a lot of access to this in a global sense will be very excited about producing lots of local content. They know the local stories. And in some ways, if you watch what's happening in the U.S. in terms of local news gathering organizations are shrinking as fast as anything. And it could be that local volunteer news gatherers will replace them even more so than the international.
Well,
I think this is all about relevance and context, right? I mean, like any media, it can be completely irrelevant and I wouldn't care, I switch the channel, but, we're going to have 8,000 channels of television and we'll have 10,000 top bloggers that I could pay attention to. It's a question of what is relevant and what has the right context. Because, for example, there's 62 million songs out there published, right? What is relevant to me and what has the right context? That's what media does, right? It selects the context and the relevance. It's like a curation, right? And to be a curator, it's not enough to know 5 songs. You have to know 50,000 songs, right? And that's where the border to the professional becomes established.
Well, that gives us some idea of a sprinkling of some of the media megatrends that are really part of our lives today and certainly rushing towards us tomorrow. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Heemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're talking about technology versus copyright. What does the future bring? Glenn?
Well, technology is challenging copyright in that everything is copyable. Everything exists essentially as a set of ones and zeros now. And therefore, the idea of copies in the old sense of making limited numbers of copies and so on is throwing everything up in the air. And there's a person named Larry Lessig who argues that the trap we're falling into is that in previous times when new copy technology got invented, let's say like videotape machines, there was a period of time in which the technology was allowed to kind of play out before rules were finally decided on. And today we're rushing too fast to trying to stick the technology into old rules and instead of letting things emerge.
Now, Larry Lessig is the guy who developed the Creative Commons. Gerd, what do you think is the essential issue of technology versus copyright? Copyright, obviously, the implied right of the creator.
There's a couple really important points here. I think this is really crucial because it impacts everything we do in media. One is that the computer or a computer is a copying device by default. That's what it does, right? That's what it's supposed to do. And the internet is essentially like a giant network of copying devices, right? And so the idea of saying that a copy is something that you pay for while the performance, which is broadcasting, is essentially free, that has been tradition in the past, right? In music, you watch television, which used to be free or is free to a large degree, but then when you buy the video, you pay for it, right? So the very definition of a copy versus a performance is evaporating because the performance in the computer is a copy, right? This sounds kind of technical, but anything that comes down over the network can be and is saved.
But the copyright is also the intellectual property that has been created by an individual and is the way in which you can actually preserve and protect the rights that are implied within that piece of content?
Yeah, and as a writer, it's an interesting one to think about. What do I really want to preserve in terms of this is mine, you don't have any right to say this, you don't have any right to do this. I remember being served papers one time by somebody who said, you cannot use this phrase anymore. And I said, well, wait a minute, I was using that phrase 10 years ago, so you're the one who can't use it anymore. But that whole world, that whole interchange seemed very strange to me, like how far should that go? And to me, that is very much up in the air. And the phenomenon of the digital native generation, this large group of young people born in the age of computers, therefore in the age of owning a thing that is itself a copying device, is one, if you look at surveys of the way that they work, they don't even recognize that this should be an issue or is an issue. The idea of using this and then being told that that is quote unquote illegal, it doesn't make any sense to them. And I think that's an indicator of how confusing in this new network world that we have the issue of copyright law is and has become.
You know, technology has always been a major disruptor of everything. I mean, starting with the railway, as opposed to using horses to get around, to the telephone, to electricity, right? It's completely disrupted everything. I mean, the way that music could initially be consumed is you go to the concert, right? There was no other way of getting music, right? Then it was recording equipment that completely evaporated this idea of you got to go there to get it, right? As many people have quoted, sort of controlled with your feet, the distribution of music. Now it became electric. And so basically this whole development has always been the same thing, as that first there's an enormous pushback. You can't do this, you can't have radio. Radio was illegal for a long time, right? It wasn't licensed, wasn't allowed. Cable TV was illegal. The Xerox machine was illegal, right? And in some cases, the fax machine people fought over. So then when it became part of industries, it just made the whole thing explode. And the laws were changed or amended or new ones were added, right? So I think we're looking at a very drastic shift right now, that the idea of copyright obviously is very useful and very powerful for the creator, but really what matters is the usage right that has to be monetized, right? So while my content is being used, I don't care if you quote on it or if you change it or if you color it red, you have to give credit. And if that means that you're doing something commercial, then I get cut in on the revenue flow. So in practical terms, for example, on music, on social networks, should get a piece of the revenue flow of what's happening on those social networks, right? But it has to be allowed, because if it's not, what we're facing is that a complete drive towards people putting people into the criminal sector because we don't license them, right? This would be exactly the same as saying that every person using a Xerox machine is a criminal. Mm-hmm. Right? And this kind of definition, that's a definition that eventually will not be sanctioned by the courts either, because it basically makes every single person a criminal. That's what we have now. every single person downloading music, which pretty much everyone is doing in the age of 10 to 20, is a criminal.
Glenn, with all of the new technology and new technological platforms, the ownership of those platforms is vested usually in large companies or the creators that make the programs.
Right.
The question of copyright and the ownership, open source computing has changed a lot of that, where there is a movement that wants to democratize the accessibility.
And yeah, and it's been, and the open source movement, of course, has been very successful in terms of spurring creativity and sort of just relaxing the sense of, let's say, danger in trying things. The concept of usage rights that Gerd referred to is one that I think makes sense as a future framework to use. And that might mean that when you buy a device, built into the price is some payment that you make that gives you the usage right to anything that can be copied through that device. It might be other subscription models as well, but that's about the only model that I can come up with that really makes sense. Open source as applied to various kinds of software domains, hardware domains, also is one that I think is only going to gain, because otherwise you're in this constant fight between owners and pirates, owners and criminal 10-year-olds and so on. And it's sort of a lose-lose as long as you're in that game. But if you can move past that into some kind of usage rights, then you can create a win-win where there's a lot more creativity and potentially more revenue stream.
This is where the Creative Commons license makes sense, right? If you're in an early stage of development as a writing musician or filmmaker or so, you may want to donate, in parentheses, put your content into the pipeline in return for the exposure. Just like on Wikipedia, you contribute until a certain point somebody says, wow, you're number 2 on Wikipedia, maybe we can hire you. And then you're off to something else. So Creative Commons makes a lot of sense there. At a certain point, you want to convert that into a more of a monetization approach, right? So it's different for different levels of artists, right? And I think the law and the practice of the law has to support a gradient, right? So that it's not everyone is forced into the same. Right? If I want to assign my rights to the public and say, do what you wish with this in return for the link back, that should be just as legal as if I'm saying I don't want to give it to anyone, except for one obvious thing that's obviously happening is as soon as I release something that can be digitized, that's apart from a sculpture or something, it's going to go out there. So we need a default license, for example, for the use of music on digital networks. There has to be a default license. Otherwise,
You don't sustain the copyright.
You can't, there's no way you can sustain it just by mere threat of litigation by saying that, you are using it now, so every single person becomes a potential lawsuit, right? So what you have to do is you have to say, here's a standard license for the use of this music on digital networks, and that's available just as if you were starting a radio station. There's a default license you can use. You don't have to argue about it. Right? So the reality is that copyright is a construct to protect the artist's rights, and that has to be maintained, of course. Right? But the practice of it has to lead to an arrangement of licensing that is easily available. So you don't have things like YouTube, right, where essentially you build a huge audience without any licenses whatsoever, because there aren't any you could get. Right? I mean, the fault of the music industry is by and large is there are no licenses you can get. You want to be legal? It's not available. So you just got to shut down and go away.
And Glenn, the same thing applies obviously to patents and the development of new technologies and new processes, new business practices.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, it seems to me that just recently the U.S. Patent Office tightened up some rules about that, so you couldn't get patents quite so easily, because people have been racing to stop things. If you just pay a little bit of attention, it's amazing how more slowly we are developing certain critical things because patents are too easily granted, or they're, in my opinion, longer than they need to be. I know about lead times and about the need to recoup all that investment and so on, but I think more liberal usage laws, even in those areas, would lead to faster developments, and again, to a kind of positive feedback system that would generate more ideas, more revenue, and so on, than trying to always lock ideas down.
In creative terms, music, television, filmmaking, book writing, I think the future is clearly going to be a reduction of the length of copyright, with a much bigger boost in the beginning, because digital technologies will give me instant access to those 3 billion people using a cell phone. So if I want to make 100 million, I can probably do it a lot quicker. So there's no point in extending my copyright to 100 years. I mean, I think we're going to look at all reality. Right now, it's 75 years life of the author, I think in Europe. That is going to probably be reduced somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 years. And I think that is, I would support that as the right move in the right direction.
And even that's kind of long when you think about this, the speed of change, the generational shifts and so on. Even that seems like it would be sufficiently generous that by 25 years from now, these ideas are going to be so obsolete, except the ones that are really classic, of course, and then you want everybody to have them anyway. And if you can't recoup your
let's keep in mind,
money in 25 years, that's plenty of time.
Keep in mind that it's not the artist who's asking for this, but the representative of the artist, because they are the ones monetizing it, right? So the artist knows, I mean, just ask Bob Dylan, right? The artist knows what it takes to create new content, which is old content.
That gives us a good window view on the wrongs and the rights of copyright. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Heemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're looking at what is beyond Web 2.0. Glenn, give us your wisdom on the subject.
Well, I want to jump way ahead, and I want to talk about Web 3.0. And in fact, people will probably be so tired of the number 0.0 that there won't be a Web 3.0. There'll be some other name for it. Web 2.0, obviously, most people are familiar with the idea that it's a more interactive form of the web. We can just kind of leave it there. It's a way for users to come in and add things, do things, respond to things, and create something that's interactive rather than more passive viewing.
And when was the starting point of Web 2.0 versus Web 1.0?
You know, I don't know the exact answer to that. Maybe 3 years ago. Does that sound about right to you, Gary?
Yeah, about then.
Yeah. That the first opportunities to go in and add responses, and then the blogging world was in some ways maybe marks the real starting point of any user can come in and make comments. I mean, I certainly at my website 10 years ago had a chance for people to write responses, and so in that sense it was already a little bit interactive, but the tools were crude and simple, and now of course they're complex. But rather than asking whether Web 2.0 will, or how it will evolve in the next 2 or 3 years, I would like almost in science fiction kind of terms to jump ahead 10 or 15 or 20 years and think about the web that might emerge, and I think that would be kind of fun.
And what do you think it would be?
To do. I think it'll have 2 characteristics. One, it'll be, or let's say 3, 3-dimensional, so that most of the time you will experience it all around you rather than on some device that you're looking at. In that sense,
and this is not just audio.
This is not just audio, but visual, and there'll be a couple of visual tools that I'll describe. It'll be not only 3-dimensional, therefore it'll be fully immersive or more immersive. And third, it'll be an augmentation of reality such that you might be in it and in real world at the same time. So it's kind of complicated, but I've had this, so that's my take on it. Maybe I'll let Gerd sort of jump in, and then I'll describe what that world is look like. What do you see beyond?
I think basically for me, Web 2.0 means, all the ideas that have been cooked up about what the web could do, they're finally becoming reality. That's really what Web 2.0 means.
That's a good description.
We talked about push media in 1997. What do we got today? Wow, we got push media. We got YouTube, we got RSS feeds, we got podcasting, right? So that's sort of, it's basically saying that the first part of the ideas, those were practically speaking rather useless. Ideas were great, but it couldn't be realized. You know? There was no broadband, there was no flash, right? I mean, flash is the major enabler of media on the web today because the embedded object stuff, the widgets, you know, the ubiquity of flash drives all these things in terms of media, right? That wasn't even available 2 years ago. So for me, that essentially that is one thing. Next thing is really that I think that the whole idea of the web and reality being any different is completely going out the door, right? I mean, online, offline is not going to be a definition. I mean, if you, if you're one of those digital natives, you don't even know what offline means except for mental state, you know, because
That's true.
Because that is the same thing. So this idea of web being web and reality being, that is completely going to go away.
So what will go away is the sense of, well, let me stop talking and go on the web for a little while. And instead,
Yeah, you go like this and you pull
they'll
up
simultaneously.
information, you know.
And literally, that's it.
So you're
Now,
going to describe some
So
of
I'm
the...
going to describe, some of the tools, and many people are familiar with these tools and have seen them either, in television shows or seen them in labs that they visited and so on, or at least have heard about them. But let's take augmented reality glasses, which now are pretty crude sets of television screens or virtual retinal displays that can paint an image onto your eyeball and a camera that looks forward, so that if you have one of these devices on, I could be sitting here with one of these devices on and I could see you, and I could see a computerized space which still looks relatively two-dimensional. But with a virtual retina display, it is possible to get that all around you so that it is three-dimensional. At the same time, I can see through it. And the recent introduction by Microsoft of a computing device they call Surface, you haven't seen it yet. It's a tabletop about the size of this tabletop, a little smaller. It's basically a big computer screen. I had a chance to advise a little bit on their team.
Oh, yes.
And it's the first true gesture-based kind of mass market computer device that I've seen. And literally, so you have a big computer screen and you can wave your hand on and do things. And at the lab that I'm part of at the University of Washington, some years ago, we were doing things where there would be a camera pointing down and it would see your hand and you could do a mouse click by doing this, and you could point and you could use two fingers to do certain things. And so it's gesture-based. Well, probably not having to wear gloves, but maybe you'll have something that you're wearing that can see your hands with a wide enough field. So if you do this with your hand and it learns a certain gesture, it'll mean call up a web page that I can see in my glasses. And Bruce, you're wearing glasses, so one of your glasses will have a little half screen that we can't really see, or we can maybe see it's a little more opaque than the rest of the glass, but for you, that's a computer screen. So if you went like this, there would be an article that you want to refer to while you're in this interview, or something much more immersive. And then recently I've read about, have not yet really seen, some work to try to interlay Google Earth with a program like from Linden, like Second Life, so that the fictionalized, three-dimensional Second Life world becomes the real world in real time, so that then I can go into that world and do things that are real in that world, even though it's a digital version of the real world. And you just step out the computing power, the bandwidth power, and so on. 5-10 years, the generational issues is kids who have grown up with all of that find that that's normal life. That's not weird. That's normal life. Then we'll look back at the internet that we've had till now and we'll say, well, it was a little better than reading newspapers, really not that much better.
I totally agree. I think the impact on media on this is going to be absolutely humongous. I mean, if you think about what that means, is I can pull up a link, basically out of space, from the surface, and that will play the entire program of Twilight Zone or whatever I've picked there, as a link, And this actually goes back to the conversations, about media. Is in general, I think this is really about the data. The important part here is the data, and also the security of the data, the privacy of the data, and the keeping of the data. And that is the value also for advertising, right? Which basically means I share some of it, and in return I get something back, right? Mm-hmm. So,
Glenn, this all sounds like Star Trek. Is this stuff that is eminently real and tangible?
In fact, it's frequently compared to, or I've seen it compared to. Let's say I've seen it compared, for example, by the director of Microsoft Research to the holodeck in the more recent versions of Star Trek. And we were creating fully immersive virtual reality booths in the 1990s is a company that I was a part of, and it would have, we had 2 walls, and we had ceiling, we had floor, and you could go then be inside that, and each one of these things would be a projector screen, and you could float down the, the Grand Rapids, or the Grand Canyon, or you could go over Niagara Falls and do various things. And that was kind of almost a holodeck-like experience, but it was way too expensive to do, and it was relatively crude. And that's where we're headed. It won't be quite that. It's not going to be a holodeck, not in our lifetimes. But it's going to begin to have that kind of feel of being able to walking down the street. Let's suppose you're walking down the street in Manhattan, and you pull up or you call up into a device that you're wearing. Maybe they're built into contact lenses. Let's say you're walking in Manhattan and you want to know what's 10 blocks ahead. Well, one of the things you could do would be to call up on your device and look at some camera version, but you could also in this space make a gesture, and suddenly you're floating above all the skyscrapers and looking down at it yourself using, say, a Google satellite view, and see what's there, as though you suddenly became a floating person or a flying person. And that's not at all out of the question.
Maybe coffee shops will feature in this feature as well, because you'll be more propelled.
Yeah, and it sounds at the one hand just really crazy science fiction. On the other hand, it kind of has a certain allure to it. And then if you've grown up with always being connected to the digital world and not really sensing that much of a separation between real world, digital world, it seems like just kind of a logical extension.
I mean, go back to the Web 2.0 thing that we have today. I think this is extremely exciting developments that companies do stuff like Ajax or Flash-based environments, where you can do all these things that were discussed 10 years ago. Now, especially in media, that's really driving a whole different way of how people access media, how they share it. And one thing that media business has to learn, of course, is that the sharing of media is completely built into Web 2.0, right? I mean, it's entirely based on sharing. So as Don Tapscott has written in his book, Wikinomics,
Good book.
There are lots of companies have spent all their time building walls, and those are the ones who are crumbling. And lots of really good companies have spent all their time taking down the walls and basically creating a mechanism to share, like Google has. Right? So we see now the market value of Google and other companies, way surpassing that of Warner Music Group, for example.
So there we are, Web 2.0, interesting observations about the pathway and the flight path to Web 3.0. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Hiemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're going to talk about the future of advertising. What's your view on the future of advertising?
I think we have to sort of do away with the term advertising as we know it, which most of us have sort of a negative...
What would you call it?
Well, I call it convertising, which is content and advertising mixed up.
Convertising.
Convertising.
I think we've definitely got to copyright that term.
I have.
Then what do you think of this notion of convertising? Do you think that there's a link between content and advertising?
Content, well, I would add context in advertising.
Right.
Imagine this scenario. And I was part of a process once where we imagined this scenario. And I think it's quite real. You arrive at the San Francisco airport, and you're going to take BART somewhere. And as you
BART is the Bay Area
Rapid Transit System. So
right.
It's a subway, sometimes below ground, sometimes above ground train. And as you get on the train, you have a chance, there's a bin, and you have a chance to pick up a set of wraparound glasses to wear. And they're like sunglasses. You think, oh, free sunglasses, this is cool. So you put on your free sunglasses. But then when you look out the window, when you're above ground and you look at a certain building what you see are floating advertisements for the Starbucks that's in that building, because the glasses knows where you are, and the glasses knows that if it's looking this direction, it should show you an advertisement for Starbucks. And now you go underground and you get a little message on the glasses that says, no view for a while, would you like to watch a film or would you like to watch a video? So you watch a video for a little while. And then when you get off, you dump the glasses in the can, and the advertisers have paid BART a handsome fee, the Barrier Transfer System, for the right to hand those free glasses out as people ride the system. So it's location-based, it's location-aware, it's context-sensitive, and it's
Technically feasible.
And technically feasible, yeah.
The main thing about that is the opt-in, right? I've actually made the decision to accept.
Yeah.
Right. What's right now is advertising to a large degree is just a nuisance. You know, it's just something that we suffer through. Some of us still do on television or whenever. Right. It's something. Google AdWords, for example, has changed that. Or Gmail, as I see, yeah, I've actually been tempted to click because it was so good. I've tried. So it's actually creating value, right? So this is the
How is that different? Just explain what you've just said.
The difference is really that as I'm a mass media user, like on television, I see an ad about Pampers, or diapers or cars, and I have nothing to do with it. But as a personal receiver of a stream, for example, YouTube type individual TV experience, I can opt in to say, well, here's my interests. You can synchronize that, right? Which means the click-throughs go from $1 for 1,000 to like $40, right, for this. And that model of advertising is what Google has been pushing and preparing. I mean, Google is essentially gearing up to become the operating system of advertising, among other things, right? That's what they want to be. So the widget advertising, for example, means that as I embed a film or a piece of music on my website, that the ad that's in there is completely synchronized with the keywords and my opt-ins and the opt-ins of the target group, right? So this is very smart technology-driven advertising that will make the traditional 30-second commercials pretty much superfluous to a large degree.
And the word we haven't used yet, I don't think, is personalized. And this, obviously, advertising is on the verge of becoming more personalized. It is when you're shopping at Amazon, the ads, of course, are more personalized to your track record.
Well, there's a whole development of dynamic advertising that changes depending upon the data mining that they can attribute to you.
Correct. And how far we'll be comfortable with that is an interesting question. But to go, if you take the glasses analogy or what Gert was just saying, you imagine the device being able to, if you've given it permission to communicate with the PDA that you're carrying, or the watch that is keeping track of certain kinds of things. And so it will say, well, on this road, I'm interested in restaurants because I'm really hungry. So show me all the restaurants as I'm driving and I'll pick one out, and so on. And so it can be, or, I've just had a kid and all the records indicate that I've just had a young child, therefore show this person all the ads for things that would relate to that. That seems like a very logical outcome. It's out of, again, science fiction movies where somebody's walking past a billboard and the billboard says, Bruce, you need a new such and such, and we all think, ooh, look at that. But
the biggest potential with this, I think, because we're talking about media here, is I think it's easily possible and to imagine that all in sort of standard media consumption will be entirely covered with advertising. I don't pay anything for media access.
So you're saying that the future of advertising is going to mean that ad-supported content is one of the definitive byproducts of this next phase?
If we forget about advertising as the nuisance factor, new type of advertising, convertising, sponsorship, placement, all that kind of idea is essentially going to be the driver in the media economy, especially for music. Because music is only, let's face it, $32 billion. Yeah? The total global advertising budget is $710 billion. I think in 2008 is what the last number I saw. Right? So music can be entirely paid easily by advertising, provided that it was licensed, right? And you're seeing this development.
That's interesting.
You're seeing this, right? This is where the iPhone is going, right?
That's pre-Big China and pre-Big India.
Yeah.
And pre-African economic development and so on. So those numbers will only get bigger.
So Glenn, do you see, for example, take the Super Bowl, which boasts the most expensive advertising of the year in the United States, that a Super Bowl ad would also be accompanied by contextizing?
Well, yes, absolutely. Take a world where everybody has digital television, and everybody has a DVR system of some kind connected to that, which is connected to the web, which is tracking everything they've watched. And so every digital television could potentially get a variation on ads. So when it's ad time, this is an interesting one, that is, instead of seeing the ad for Volkswagen, maybe there are 5,000 different ads that are shown to all the different televisions, depending on what that television needs at that time.
And in a sense, this was the first experimentation in the last Super Bowl where Frito-Lay got citizen advertising
Yes, yeah,
for
yeah.
citizens to come up with their own version of the ad with the promise that they might be able to get it floated on the...
That was a little bit of it, but I'm really thinking more of an ad that I'm sitting in my watching the Super Bowl, and I'm seeing one ad, and my neighbor across the street is seeing a different ad.
Which is happening now.
Yeah, which
I mean,
which is,
we're going to see this happening. Clearly, AT&T deal with Napster just last year for free music if you buy AT&T cell phone service. Where we're going clearly is going to be all the handset operators and mobile operators and telcos will eventually say, look, all you have to do is opt into this advertising scheme here. We'll send you one multimedia a week on your phone. You watch this, music is free.
But the key is that it's got to be non-obtrusive. It's got to be impactful, but non-obtrusive.
Yeah.
And the other main challenge, of course, is significant, is going to be what in the Matrix is called the grid. Am I going to be on the grid or not? I think basically where we're moving is a society to where the grid is a very attractive option because you get all this stuff in return. But I'm really worried, I would be worried, ultimately about the grid, in parentheses, being able to assemble all these things for other uses.
Do you think that the advertising agencies have the skills to try and read the future like this? Do you think it's a function of the way that they're operating today?
I don't know the answer to that really. I would say probably some do and some don't. And they're obviously they tend to be creative people, and but they may be a little short on that kind of long-term technological vision.
Right.
And then of course a lot of it is timing. We can see things. In some ways we can see what it's going to look like more easily 5 or 10 years from now than we can next year or the year after, because of the technology cycles that are happening. The first thing on who will have access to and use this information, my working assumption is, for better or worse, people hate this, but that if it exists, then government agencies are going to have access to it at some point, unless the world really changes in terms of perceived dangers and their therefore desired powers of government to see things. But we're clearly moving in a world where you just have to assume that everything you're doing is transparent and be as comfortable with that as you can be.
The chairman of one of the largest ad groups in the world has spoken about the new mission of advertising agencies is to try and protect and extend the DNA of the product. And the reason being that if the public believe in and have a reliability in a product, and you can keep reinforcing what the core DNA of that product is, that is the way that you will breed customer loyalty, brand recognition, and brand reinforcement.
But of course, the biggest challenge there, it's a lot easier to create that for a mass, looking at the lowest common denominator. Right. So you put up iPod posters all over, which have cool art and stuff, and they appeal to lots of people. But to cover niche markets that you may have nothing to do with, in different media that using different formats, using different creative, that requires a whole different way for the ad agencies to come up with the goods. Right? In other words, that's not as mass, not as huge, not as expensive. Right? So to come up with that creative, I think there'll be lots and lots of people will create the creative work for these ads in the community itself.
So what we might see then in the future of advertising is a classified ad taken out digitally, which might say, man with John Deere tractor looking to meet a woman with a trailer, the object to get hitched. Maybe that's the future of advertising as well. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Heemstra and Gerd Leonhard, and today we're talking about commercial culture versus shared culture. Have there been any proponents of this notion of a shared culture that have come up with a new matrix of defining it? Are there any people you can think of that have actually floated this and seen this actually manifesting?
Well, I think, of course, the most prominent proposal in this regard is the Creative Commons movement, which I use a lot when I publish blogs or white papers.
That's Lawrence Lessig from the law department at Stanford University.
Right, creativecommons.org is the idea of saying, okay, at a certain point I may wish to publish and have other people have free use of it, including adaptations and things. And in other cases, I may not want commercial use, so I can assign a separate, it's like a brand, like a tag to it.
So it's almost like a flexible usage right, depending upon what you, the creator, determine, versus what the media companies or the bigger companies like to control your participation.
Yeah, the danger, I think, is clearly as follows, is that it is possible now for content owners to sort of assert their copyright in technical ways, like copy protection, but also in practical ways of like suing YouTube and in identifying, any song that plays on the web, about 2 seconds will allow me to identify it. So in theory, I can put this filter on and say anything that's for me, not allowed, right? And a lot of people are starting to do this. In fact, I think there's a recent report on Wired surfaced that YouTube has a company that's spending $100,000 a day on filtering content by hand, manually, like a police that they have employed.
Wow. And a technical tool would be easy to develop.
Right, and those things are now starting to surface. Now, if we play this out, it could very easily mean that 2 or 3 years from now, everything that's out there on these networks is somebody's definitive property. Right? Somebody who is claiming rights for an image, claiming rights for a stream, claiming rights for a text, a patent.
How can you police all of this? It's impossible.
Yeah, right. So basically what's happening is that we have to, at a certain point, we have to say, there's a public process here, right? That is, I wouldn't call it public domain, but it's fair use, right? And as what's happening, of course, especially in the US, is the fair use is being chucked, piece by piece by piece by piece, further and further, in the sense of all the companies who own, in parentheses, the rights to the content, asserting the right to maintain it longer. While, of course, this is an immediate sort of shock reaction to them. So, saying, you can't use my videos on YouTube. This is all going to, I think it's all going to revert to a place to where these companies say, we're going to allow it if we get cut in, because that's the commercially viable way, very much like radio or the copy machine or the levy for CDs in Europe and so on and so on.
Glenn, have you got any views on this subject?
Well, this is a story. This is a true story. About 2 weeks ago, I got a phone call and an email from somebody who said, are you aware that a corporation who I won't name has stolen the future? And he went on to say they've trademarked the word future.
How can you possibly do that?
I
don't know. And I'm a little bit skeptical of it, but that they're going to try to prevent anybody from using the word future in any product or any website. Of course, mine is futurist, so I have a little safety there. But strangely, it is pretty strange that in this digital world that we're creating, which allows so much free spreading of information, free copying of information. The whole system is built, as Gerd frequently says, to be basically a massive copying device. And therefore, it seems inevitable that it will become freer and freer and freer. There is this counterforce trying to lock it up and to gain more control. And there will, it seems like ultimately the forces of freedom will win out because the network is just too ubiquitous. But a lot of unnecessary legal battles, money spent, and so on are going to be fought about trying to figure out what is the Creative Commons and what is legitimately owned for a legitimate period of time so that you can make your dollar off of it.
I mean, it's quite clear, I think, to most media companies and most people in media now is that the real money is in sharing.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you look at what's happening, all the stuff that's driven by sharing is absolutely explosive.
Yeah.
right? And
Give
this-
us an example of what you mean.
Well, I mean, in a sharing economy, for example, if you look at all the stuff that isn't licensed in music, you know, like iMeme wasn't licensed or isn't licensed, iLike or Last.fm or Pandora, you know, who were licensed under compulsory provisions, but not really in that sort of larger ballpark. You know, all these are taken off very quickly, while the ones that were licensed and therefore restricted have not. Right, so it's becoming a handicap in the current system is to go after the license that exists because it restrains the user from doing what they want to do. So now you have thousands of companies who are constantly violating, including, of course, YouTube from the very start was in complete violation of just about every rule you can imagine. Right? And they got out the gate early, which was good for them. But in general terms, you know, I think what this means is that I think everyone who's in the media business today is trying to figure out how can we let people share, sink our hooks into that process, sell stuff based on this, be part of this overall mechanism, right? Which basically means is that you have to define a licensing structure that sits on top of what people do rather than what you want them to do.
So this leads to more accurate data mining as one of its byproducts.
Absolutely, it's a huge business to do that. There's no, I mean, you know, as a comparison to my next book, The End of Control, I've decided to make that a blog. Right? Because for
So
me,
you're not going to, in other words, you're not going to publish this as a printed title.
I've had offers and we've had discussions. I decided that for a lot of reasons, but by and large, because I want to share with people, and it's a process that's very timely. You know, I want to roll this out as I have it, and the financial benefit of the book, as a printed book, is in no comparison to the financial benefit of rolling it out the stuff right here. Right? I mean,
You know, that's a really interesting question because I'm. This diverts us a little bit. So Gere's going to do a book, and he's going to do it as a blog, which has the advantage of getting out probably to hundreds of thousands, millions of people faster, and you'll generate a lot more activity. Now, I'm planning another book, and my model right now still is publisher, hardback, print, and so on. Now, why would I do that? And I do debate whether that's a good idea. And then blog the book. Then blog, and once the book is out, then blog about the book so that people can get into an interactive process about the book, but with the book out. The reason that I am still thinking about doing that, there is a certain credibility that goes with the book, but there's also a certain longevity, which is really, it's a whole nother topic, I suppose, and we could do another show on this, and I get asked this, what is the historical longevity of the digital archives? I had an author with whom I was working on a television show, and he writes a lot of books, and his wife said, "Why are you wasting your time on this TV show? 100 years from now, nobody will ever remember that TV show, but your book will still be on the shelf. Write your next book." And that's the question of blogging a book. If it's never turned into a book, will 100 years from now it be gone? And maybe that doesn't matter.
Well, Glenn, as a futurist, what is going to be the view about shared content going forward? What do you think? Where do you think this is all heading?
By shared content on whether it should be shared or whether it'll last a long time.
Whether it'll last a long time?
The answer is nobody really knows because the medias that we're producing have limited lifetimes. There's already a scramble going on to try to transfer older media, let's say floppy disk material, probably that process is either done or too late, just about to different kinds of DVD or CD plastic material. And then the question is what's going to come after that. But it's pretty clear that historical records, if you look at how historians work, they're always looking at documents, namely paper, sometimes stone, that are hundreds or thousands of years old. And we have no way of saying, and in fact, it's probably safer to say that the stuff we're producing now will not last for thousands of years. So future historians won't be able to go back and look unless we have some kind of regular updating process, which is a whole nother subject. But it leads to an interesting question about, in terms of the books, and I diverted a little bit about what should be shared and what shouldn't be. On the what should be shared, by the way, one last thought is the website futurist.com, for example, is all free information. We compete with a lot of consulting companies who have walls behind which you can't get unless you're paying them a bunch of money. We've said everything we write just goes out free. Anybody can see it. And we feel like that generates more traffic, more interest, and in the long run, at least by my standard, generates enough, so that's fine. And I think that that's a better model. But again, all that stuff is there. It's not in a book. It's just going to disappear into the ether at some point.
Yeah, I mean, in music there has been lots of discussion. People have argued that without protection, there won't be creation.
Right.
Which is
Yes.
perverse,
Yeah.
in my view. Simply for the following reason, I think that ultimately without sharing, there won't be any music, right? Because basically, if all I'm worried about protecting what I have created, I shouldn't be taking anything from you, because you may have also this little wall around yourself. And in music, or in any art really, everybody is taken off each other, because it's impossible not to. I mean, you'd have to live in a glass house to do that, or in a zoo, So basically, the impetus behind creating is what I get from others, what kind of environment I live in, right? So it's a give and take thing. So protecting that too much basically creates this walled thing around me, which means I probably won't be creating much because I'm isolated, right? So the very discussion behind digital rights management, digital protection, is to prevent that sharing. That sort of takes the juice right out of the mechanism. Right? I mean, if you think back to our days, we used to go and hang out at each other's house and listen to vinyl, and then we would try to catch a song when it's on radio and record it, and that was the sharing mechanism, right? So today, that is sharing links and metadata and playlists. Is a very, very important thing to preserve that, and make that part of the environment as a driver, rather than as a sort of opposed activity.
Well, maybe this whole notion of the shared culture versus the commercial culture, or the ongoing tussle between it, is going to be one of the signatures of the millennials going forward. Interesting discussion, shared versus commercial. You be the judge. This is Ralph Simon with another edition of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Hiemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're going to talk about the future of user-generated content. What's your view on UGC, user-generated content?
Well, it's a huge, huge growth area. Nothing has changed the world. Well, that's an exaggeration. Not much has changed the world more than the blogs. I mean, it's been astonishing to watch what's happened with the desire of so many people to say so much. Who knew? And now with YouTube, we see it in the media visual world as well. I'm constantly astonished at the amount of time that people apparently have, and the desire to put something out there to be seen or heard.
Just how widespread is UGC?
Well, I think we have to differentiate. I said there's two different things happening here. One is what I call truly user-generated content, which is a lot of blogs are, and other ones are really user-generated context. To some degree regurgitating what's already there, and using stuff that somebody else has made or linking to it. What's called splogs, spam blogs, and in the blogging world. Splogs. Yeah, they automatically suck off content and make a new one to place ads, right? This is the equivalent of spam, and there's a lot of that happening, right? So the user-generated idea is, to a large degree, is mixed up in all different levels, all the way from copying and blogging to linking to commenting and then creating really truly original content, right? So there's all these shades are happening on the web. And what's happening right now is that I think that the drive of, for example, in the blogging business or in people sharing videos and stuff, is essentially creating a bit of a first wave where anything goes. People put up stuff about how they're laughing in front of TV and put that up, and they think that's funny, but only 34 people would ever watch it, right? So it's sort of like it's an early wave of experimentation. Ultimately, I think that what we're seeing is, as in blogs, for example, about 75% of bloggers pretty quickly drop blogging. because they realize it's actually a bit of work. You know, it's not like you can just write because you can go to Typepad or Blogger, you know. So what Typepad and Blogger and WordPress and everybody else is doing is they're creating self-publishing tools. Right? It's no longer just about typing and putting it up. It's self-publishing music, self-publishing media, self-publishing films. And so this whole thing is merging into a multimedia experience. Clearly, Six Apart, which is one of the biggest blogging companies in the world, owns Typepad and LiveJournal and Vox. They launched Vox.com, which is a multimedia experience. You can put up any film, pretty much, any sort of music, and you can stream it to the world.
So are you saying then that user-generated content is effectively the lubricant of social networks?
Well, to a large degree it is, and its sustainability, I think, is an interesting question, as Gerd was just raising. Is it one that 5 years from now we'll find that most people kind of got tired of it? Now, maybe the new tools will be continually spectacular enough that there's a new wave and then a wave after that. But my guess is that there will be a certain percentage, and it might be a pretty significant percentage, and that would mean millions of people, who find it continually interesting, potentially even at least a little bit financially lucrative, because they can produce such quality, because they want to devote so much time, that we'll see a continual growth. But we'll see a lot of stuff fall back. But the social networks, which are another aspect of it, I mean, everybody wants to fill up their social network with material, and then people learn about this or that video or this or that blog through the social networks, and that's what sort of drives all the traffic. And that doesn't show any signs of abating to me.
Can you think of any pertinent examples of user-generated content that has really exploded into the mass?
Well, I think, again, we're really early. I think the best examples here really are the blogs for the time being, because they have become their own.
Right.
You know, and right now, I mean, everybody who launches something new wishes to be covered by blogs. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is the hottest thing, right? All the PR agencies are like, oh, you know, I don't know about Business Week, or so we'll get those guys anyway.
Let's go to Technorati.
We need these guys to cover us, you know. So I think the biggest difference in some of these aspects is that, for example, in television, television existed because, you know, I thought I was great and I put a show on television, and then you can watch it and you can agree that I'm great, but it's not going to be your stuff on TV ever, right? Now it's the other way around. I publish stuff that I think is great, and then everybody else can do the same, and everybody else can sort of try to get to a TV type position, right? They can be watched, they can express themselves. And I think that itself has tremendous value to people doing it. It does not, however, mean that everything they do actually has the same value than what used to be professionally produced in the same way. It's a different layer, right? Just like blogging, you know, blogging is intensely personal. And you have to take it for what it's worth. It's not objectively researched, or most of it isn't. It's just one opinion. So I read the Wall Street Journal, I read Financial Times, and I read the blogs, and that together gives me the coverage I want.
Now, there's a story going around Hollywood at the moment that seeking out new talent, the new filmmakers, the best way that Hollywood is actually seeking out perhaps the next Steven Spielberg is to look at user-generated content on YouTube. Is this an example of what you're talking about, the widening influence and impact of UGC?
Yeah, and I think I'm sure that's a good idea, because it's amazing. You know, a lot of stuff, actually it's amazing when you look at YouTube and you think, who would have thought to put that up, and why would anybody go look at it? Then you do discover only 12 people have looked at it. But
do you think it justifies the $1.65 billion that Google paid for it now?
Yeah, I think so.
Easily.
I think so, because the desire to put stuff up, the desire to become visual, the net is going to become more and more visual, and in fact, talent is going to emerge. I mean, we all know of young people ourselves who are creative types, and there's nothing harder in the creative world than to get discovered. And if you've got a tool that at least gives you a shot at more and more people noticing, and then that rumor leaks to somebody who is one of these talent scouts, and they may wander across it, but it's more likely that some social network will say, you know, Judy saw this on YouTube, you ought to go take a look. and they go take a look and they say, that's one cut above. Maybe we'll see if they did anything else, and on the story goes, and before you know it, they've been
It's really just an
discovered.
enlargement of what we had before. As a band before, you'd go pack up your stuff in a van, and you'd play a gig everywhere you can, and somebody would maybe discover you. Now you pack up your stuff and you put it on MySpace, and maybe somebody will run across you.
Yeah.
And you still do the gigs.
This is like the example of the married couple, long married. I think they were either Greek or Italian, where the husband and the wife were both cooks, and they would have the repartee in their own kitchen, and the husband would give the wife a pat on the butt as a kind of show of affection, and this became a cult offering on YouTube. This is another form of user-generated content, where you're basically creating your own mini culture that then spreads into the mass.
Yeah, and I have, I personally know a couple of people who have made it an ambition to become a television show. And so what they've done is produce a little YouTube clip. I don't think that really one of them wants to be a cook, have a cooking show, which are, of course, are big deals. And it is an awfully good way to sort of do a demo tape and at least have a shot at a lot of people watching.
I think this goes also with the discussion of what I call the people formerly known as the consumers, which I borrow from the Prince definition of him formerly known as Prince. I think what we're seeing here is that a lot of consumers, who used to be relegated to being like over there getting stuffed with content, and they still do to a large degree, but now they are saying like, wait a minute, now I got a camera, can I be like this guy? And of course, probably they can't, but at least they can try it and they can experiment. And this is a great creative process for the average person, right? Even though you may ultimately sort of be full of shit of actually achieving the same status, you still, it's a process, right? So I think what happens is consumers and users are thinking of themselves differently now as being part of the control mechanism by having value of the click. Some people even argue that the user, just by being there and by actually fishing and doing stuff, they become content, because that essentially creates the momentum, right? I mean, those big social networks like Bebo or Facebook, they wouldn't be anything without the users, just like eBay wouldn't be anything without buyers and sellers. Right, so the users in eBay are the content, right? So eventually, I think if you think this is down 5 or 10 years down the road, is an active user, no matter what they do on your network, is going to create a lot of value. So it's better to have the user than not to have a user, pretty much under any circumstance.
Yeah, and it ties into the idea of the sort of merging of let's call it real life or physical life and life on the network. Those things become more and more intertwined, so that you're just kind of in both spaces at once. And the idea of just your presence on the network being part of the content, the fact that at Futurist.com, for example, the fact that people come from all over the world, when we display that, that's part of the content of what we're displaying. Oh, look, we get people from Iran and we get people from various countries in Africa and so on. And you think, how would they ever find this little website here in the US? But they do. And in fact, it becomes a powerful content statement to say these visitors came from all over and they had no intention of being part of the content.
I think where it really undermines media and traditional media is in the definition of copyright and usage right? Again, because me as the regurgitator of this content, the reuser, I mess with this system because I'm remixing it, I'm putting a video and synchronizing it with some music.
And all of this being UGC.
Yeah, all of this being qualified as a cool stuff you can do on the web. There's hundreds of websites, Splashcast and what's it called, iWire, not iWire, whatever. There's hundreds of them, including Kite and others, that allow all these things to happen, right? So who's to say if this is legal or not? And does a songwriter have a right to revoke permission of you using it as a soundtrack on YouTube? That's bringing up a myriad of issues. Bottom line is for the media owners, participating in all of this and getting your hooks into these crowds. That is that's the next radio, right? That is the next way of getting your foot in the door, right? And so loosening up on the control mechanism here, which is sort of against the idea of guarding copyright, that is the key, and that's a dichotomy that the current content owners are facing, right? They're going to allow this and be part of it, or they're going to keep on clutching on it and be part of it without a license.
This is such an interesting discussion, interesting argument. The whole notion of user-generated content and the feeling by the consumer or the user that I gotta be me. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Hiemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're going to talk about the future of entertainment, music, and media. Gerd, where are we heading? Lincoln County or Armageddon?
I think the future is extremely hopeful to me because I think that both the creator of music and films and other intellectual property of content, they have a great opportunity in finding a way to both produce cheaper, to connect to each other, and to hook up into a default distribution pipeline that technology provides now. And the user, on the other hand, because there's so much coming in now, has this unparalleled choice, provided that they can deal with the selection process, right? Which is a problem. But it's good for both parties. What it's not good for is the traditional intermediaries. Right?
Who would you say are the intermediaries?
Well, in the music, it's the record companies, but I think in television, it's a little bit different because it requires more production, obviously more mechanism. And radio, for example, as being the intermediary between the listener and the producer, right? Those are drastic shifts impacting all the middlemen. For example, in music, it's quite clear that what is required in the future is sort of agencies, people who handle that connection, right? So whether that can be billion-dollar business, international corporations, very big question. I personally don't think a public company would fare well doing this because they're stuck between those two poles. Right? I think this is much more of an opportunity for small, medium-sized businesses and independent companies and sort of mid-sized organizations. But in general, I think the future is very bright on both ends, and the middle is sort of up for grabs.
Glenn, tell us, in terms of the future of entertainment, anytime, anywhere, any place, anyhow?
That is pretty much it, and that everything that's produced will be saved forever and available forever. Those great TV ads that somebody walks into the hotel and they say, do you have movies available? And the clerk says, any movie ever made in the history of the world. Yeah, we've got it. That's everything being produced potentially because of the expansion of memory systems is going to be available whenever you want it. The only question is, how does it get paid for? And I'm interested in what Gerd was saying, by the way, in terms of moving from the really large companies to medium and small companies. Does that mean we have to get less ambitious in terms of return so that we don't try to be the biggest media company in the world, but instead we're going to do this smaller, more concentrated thing?
Here's what's really happening there, I think, in my view, is that the obsession with sort of Rolls-Royce versus bicycle syndrome. The Hollywood thought is like you're either like the absolute biggest actor, musician, band, VIP, or you're nobody, right? Because the way that it has worked in the past is because of mass media, you can only be one or the other. Mass media is not concerned with a little guy who just made a small movie about his grass growing or something, but is concerned with the big guy, right? So in niche market media, which has zero distribution cost, anybody could sort of be a hit in those niches. Right? For a musician that is from Melbourne, Australia, all of a sudden their new age music can cover the world if he's able to find an audience in the niche. Right? So as you can see clearly already on iTunes, 10% of the sales on iTunes is classical music, right? Which nobody pays any attention to in real life,
And that only really constitutes 3% globally of the global record purchases, of music purchases.
Yeah, I think it's actually less than that. But if you're looking at what's happening there, is that
That's interesting.
The obsession with the hit and the I'm going to play at Glastonbury, I'm going to be on MTV. We have to let go of these things because really what that matters ultimately is recognition among that particular niche, the particular piece of the pie that you have, right?
So there's a potential then, I think that Gerd is saying in the future for, what are we talking about? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of significant players making a reasonable rate of return rather than this small group. There will still be a small group of mega stars who kind of come out of that, but this group could be much, much larger. Instead of the mega stars or you're a nobody, this middle group could, it seems to me, have a much more significant role to play, make a reasonable income, and to have a chance of crossing over into the mega stardom, but almost by not aiming for that.
But this is, by the way, Glenn, why big corporations will not be interested in this, right? because this process is too painful and too personal to them, right? I mean, a artist management agency has to actually talk to their artists every day. A record label has 700 acts. I'll never talk to them. They are essentially, to a large degree, they were enemies, right? But this system is not set up for a mechanical process of repetition. Doing the same thing over and over again. That worked great in the record business ever since Elvis. All the way up to the Spice Girls and Britney Spears. It was a machine, right? And so big companies will not be interested in this particular model because it does involve, personal interaction with whoever you're dealing with there, and it can't be reproduced in the same which way, right? In addition, the artist has now so many ways to go direct. I think we'll see people selling stuff through their blogs, which they already are, of course. We'll be selling access, like Prince has been doing, and Todd Rundgren has tried to do, way back. They'll be selling access to streams. They'll be selling live concert recordings, and the Go Direct feature will be a very big momentum, even for major artists.
Well, the other thing that it means for artists, as it has in other fields of work, is when we've been asked as futurists about the future of work for a long time, we've been saying, well, you need to stop thinking of yourself in the non-entertainment world as an employee and start thinking of yourself as a business of one or a portfolio of skills that you take from here to here to here. In other words, you're sort of your own brand manager. You have to take charge of your own career and say, this is who I am, this is what I do, and this is how I'm going to put myself out into the world and manage my own brand. And it means, I think, for artists, even more so than the past, the necessity of thinking in terms of managing themselves as a brand, which is a different set of skills. They may need some advice, they may need some help, and it may not be as fun as making music or making a piece of sculpture and so on. But the opportunity is there to do it, and if you do it, you have a chance to really sort of move up in terms of attention and in terms of income.
This is a very good point in the music business, because what's happening is that artists used to give away the responsibility for all that business stuff, to somebody out there. In return, they get 10% of the record sales, right? Which, we call that a plantation agreement, right? So it's essentially giving all that stuff away. So what's happening now is that the artists are saying, wait a minute, if I'm going to chat on MySpace and I'm going to use Kite to put up my mobile chats and I'm going to use a blog, why do we only get 10%? That's not right? So the artist has to take more responsibility, or their managers, which is why I think managers will hold the key to this development. For example, in television, you're going to see people who have ideas for productions, develop these things in an online environment and roll out with this before the big production companies will come in and get it. Right? So you'll see web-based television and stuff like American Idol sort of starting there. And
I'm especially interested in what happens with web-based television. And we've been hearing about 500 channels for a long time, but this ubiquitous, very high-speed broadband globally really does mean that there is the opportunity for the proliferation of thousands of television programs, which, some of which will get an audience, and it won't depend on the big production companies, although they will be players as well. And of all the entertainment fields, if you think media and entertainment, I know Garrett is very interested in music, but the future of sort of homegrown television, maybe perhaps even localized television based on web channels, I think is sort of an unexplored territory at this point. People are just beginning to realize that it's going to happen, and just the first few people are just sort of dipping their toe into it. Could we produce a scripted or unscripted kind of television program that 500,000, 1 million, 3 million, 10 million people would watch, and just put it on the web and not go through any of the classic television channels?
I think we'll have major stars in these places that only people who are in those virtual spaces will know. There'll be stars that deal with, massage therapy or something that will be like it there, but of course you wouldn't know them unless you're into it, right? Very much like what's happening with books right now.
Yeah.
But in a virtual environment, all these things can be leading to a very nice making of a living for those people, especially artists, filmmakers, writers, and so on. And the other thing, of course, on the flip side, what's happening is that because it's not possible to do it, the measurement, the expectation of being really, really, really good is going to be absolutely huge. I mean, the pressure on this will be like, you have to be even better now to get people to pay attention to you.
Well, you'll have to be really, really good. And, I've been curious about, because I had a little experience in scripted television in Hollywood, and if you watch what's happening in the television world, scripted TV is so expensive to make in comparison to reality shows and unscripted TV that it's harder and harder to get a scripted show on the air, but an independent and a web channel could do a scripted show for a lot less money. And it may not have all of the production values, but with computer graphics, you could have an awful lot of good production values. And we might actually see scripted TV move more away from the big studios and toward all these small independents.
So this is an interesting view and an interesting look at the future of content. All content available anywhere, anytime. Is that the future? Maybe it is. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Hiemstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're going to talk about the future of communication and conversation. Are we going to see an explosion of the chattering classes? What's the future?
You know, we are seeing an explosion of the chattering classes, but not quite in this way that we might have expected. Remember internet chat and remember cell phones. Recently, I was in a forum with the CEO of Skype, and Skype is tracking very closely, of course, the traffic that they're getting over that global system. And their text traffic is now outperforming their telephone, their voice traffic, and their video traffic is screaming upwards. So they believe, interestingly, and they're trying to figure out why would people prefer to text each other via Skype rather than talk to each other, and why would they prefer video? They're finding lots and lots of families who are globally remote from each other, which is very common these days, using their video traffic, which kind of belies the whole idea that people don't want to be seen when they're talking. It turns out they do. And then people really like the short, quick directness of text as compared to the kind of slowness of talking on the phone. So there's a whole lot going on in the future of communication.
So are we going to see a truncated form of conversing with each other, as has been evidenced with IM?
I think as anything that we see right now, it's not, the answer isn't like either or. It's a whole array of things that different people do, right? For example, I think that kids today don't do email, right? They have these platforms that they use, right? They chat on MySpace.
Or SMS messaging?
SMS, but they chat on these platforms, right? If I tell my 12-year-old sent me an email, I say, well, I'm going to see you on XYZ, whatever he's using, you know, High Five or whatever. That's where they do it. And Facebook, for example, has extremely harvested this kind of idea as a platform for talking. And then, of course, instant messaging is a much bigger place to share files, music, than any downloading place on the internet, right? So the record companies, for example, talking about illegal peer-to-peer downloading, that's chicken feed compared to what they do on IM and on Skype, right? Transfer file kind of idea. So this, again, is becoming a multimedia experience. And when you see the N95 and other, you know, Sony Ericsson products and some Samsung phones, you can do that stuff on the phone now, especially when you're on a Wi-Fi network, right? You can chat, you can transfer stuff, you can send a video. And companies like Kite.tv who were harvesting that, you know, I think that is the future of a multimedia communication. And again, I think people like in our age may never choose to actually participate in that way because they prefer the sort of asynchronous way of email. So what we're seeing is a whole portfolio of different ways of communication. The good old phone and the phone booth will probably stay to some degree. And then we have the whole sort of new generation of interactive, full-blown video attachments, three-dimensional, you know, data gloves, whatever, who don't even know what email is.
Yeah. In fact, I just was getting the impression as you were talking that, imagine a stack of waves, and the waves, each wave is rolling and kind of subsuming the one beneath it. When you said phone booths, I think of how many phone booths I see in airports and so on. You see them too, that are now empty of phones. They're just this booth on the wall. That
But you know what they do
that
now?
used to
They
be a
put the
phone.
wireless LAN in there.
Well,
Right? So that you can
a
go
little
in
bit.
there.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah,
Is this all
you
going to
consider there.
reduce conversation going forward?
Well, it does change the richness of conversation, and if you want to get on the, shall we say, the dark side of some of these curves, you do wonder about that. I myself, even though I'm not a young person, I find myself using instant messaging compared to email more and more. I'm still using more email, which tend to be longer messages, still shorter than phone conversations. But now that I have some easier instant message tools, I find myself using that. So I think that we see conversation becoming more and more truncated, more and more direct, less and less, to some extent, less and less polite, although that's kind of a technical measure. And what that means in terms of the ability to sort of express the full range of emotions is an interesting question, but then video comes into the picture. And that, again, is going to change the game, as we're just at the beginning of when communications can go truly video or visual. And so that might suddenly shift us way back.
I think the thing that's really disconcerting to the average person is that all these things are happening in parallel. You know, there's more coffee shops than ever. I mean, if you just look around, what is that, 4,850 Starbucks?
No. Nearly 13,000 globally.
Okay, yeah, but in the US,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, and there's every single, I mean, San Francisco, every corner is a coffee shop, right? What are people doing there? I mean, they could be chatting on the web, and they are chatting on the web, but all these things, they are really happening in parallel, right? So people have the personal contact, they go to clubs, they go to gyms, you know, they move around the world to be with somebody, they travel much more than ever before, and they chat, and they IM, and they Skype, and they make cell phone calls, and this is all a parallel effort. In fact, most kids today are doing 5 things at the same time.
So is multitasking a function of this new world?
It is very much a function of the new world. So it's a generational function. Now my kids are now in their 20s, and I can remember when they were teens, like yours, Gerd, watching them multitask. This was, 6, 8, 10 years ago already, and the early days of the web and the early days of various kinds of handheld devices, and they could multitask far beyond anything that I'd ever seen. I remember kind of walking into the home office and watching, one kid handle 5 conversations on 3 or 4 different devices at once, and I thought, this is a different world. This is really truly a different generation. It takes it way, way beyond. And again, if you add the video layer into there, that's going to be a whole other thing. An empty space that I see and do wonder about is, in fact, the lack of empty space. The world that Gerd just described, where we're traveling more, we're chatting more, we're IMing more, and so on and so on. When are we ever quiet? And there are some social observers asking, and if you watch your kids, you ask, when do they ever stop? Is there ever a moment when they're out of contact and just completely quiet? And you go back, a few decades in human history, and certainly centuries in human history, there were lots of times where there wasn't really much input at all coming
So
to
what
you.
you're saying
so
is-
does it change? Will it change us?
The problem
as a species?
isn't so much now how we can communicate, but how can we shut off? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
the challenge is not to say how I can reach you, but the challenge is to say, well, when do I get time to not reach anyone so my brain can actually come back to normal?
So does this mean that there's less reflection now in this newer world?
I think that's the danger. Now, the counter argument would be, well, if I'm so good at multitasking, I can reflect and multitask at the same time, and that may be true, particularly if the way that your brain develops depends on the environment, in part, that you grow up in. And if you've grown up multitasking in a clickable, Googleized world since you were, a baby, maybe you do have a different form of reflecting, and it could be that psychologists years from now will discover that things are different.
No, there is research saying that the brain structure is actually different.
Yeah, I know there is. There's beginning to be hints that that's true, but yeah, I do worry about reflection time. In fact, I used to tell people that I think there will be parts of the world that declare themselves gene-modified food-free areas. So if you come to this region of France, we will guarantee that there are no gene-modified foods in this region. Well, I think we might see if you go out, let's say 50 years, you might see electronic communication free zones come to this area, and you not only won't be connected, it will be impossible to be connected electronically while you're here.
Yeah, in fact, that's
and
gonna
that
be a
might be
business.
quite the big fad in terms of vacation spots and trips. Let's go to electronic free land.
We should invent a demediatizer.
The demediatizer. This
know-
is like the slow food movement. We don't want fast food. We want some reflective, slow movement.
Yeah, I don't look forward to it. I flew into Washington, D.C. last year. My cell phone fell out of my pocket in the cab that I was taking out to where I was staying. And then it took 2 days to get it back. And I remember it's a feeling of physical panic to be that disconnected. And I thought, this is really amazing.
But we
This
have
is
to remember
really
something. I
strange,
mean,
yeah.
we're so early in this thing
Yeah.
that we can be connected, that we still think it's a big deal.
Yeah.
You know, because when you're always connected, at a certain point you say like, well, I can switch this on anytime I want to, so it's not becoming sort of compulsive. You know,
Yeah.
this is like, you know, when the telephone first came around, a lot of people who were in small villages said, why would I want that? I can just go over and talk to him, right? But after it becomes sort of a standard, so well, people may not be using it for 3 weeks in a row because it's no big deal. So we're still in that first phase where the excitement about having this gadget wins over the actual use. So we just make a call to make a call.
Let's get some digital natives in a glass-walled room and remove all of their devices and put them in there for 3 weeks and see if they go crazy. I think that'll be interesting. But to me, those are interesting issues in terms of where human communication is really going to go. That was my actual academic field way back, was the form of communication. In the early 80s, I was looking at transcripts of conversations on the precursor of the internet called the ARPANET, where people were doing group team tasks. And I was studying for how would communication be different when we were in computer networks. And the bottom line answer, crazy and simple though it sounds, is people were less polite. They didn't say, oh, excuse me. They would just sort of skip over that when they were giving an instruction. Where if you're face to face, you'll say, well, that was nice, but I have a question about this. In the instant message world, you just say, I have a question about this, and you skip the part of the sentence that says, that was nice. And so we've become more direct, less polite. It hasn't been a big disaster, but those kinds of changes in human communication carried out over generations could lead to differences that we can't anticipate.
But then again, of course, in a real conversation, I couldn't just pull out an image of a horse and show it to you, because I don't have an image of a horse. On the web, when we're chatting, I can make an icon, and it's a horse jumping up and down, and you can have a laugh. You know, so
that's true.
another
That's
way
true.
that we can communicate.
So in that way, it's richer.
Right, it's richer that way, and it's also maybe more funny or more, it's a different language, right? So what I'm saying is like, these all exist in parallel.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And that is the disconcerting part. I think that people connect on different levels, and they don't see how you can connect on these levels, but they still exist.
Yeah.
And in media, what that means is that, I get this question all the time, for example, from cell phone companies or hardware manufacturers, will people listen to music on the phone? And the answer is, well, some people will listen compulsively, others never will. Right? It's basically varied. Right? So the opportunities in communications and media are on various levels in various countries for various target groups at various times. Right? No such thing as one thing for everyone.
The other part of the answer is if the battery will last.
And that is a good segue for us to note that the future of conversation and communication will still be an art, and the chattering classes will not stop chattering. This is Ralph Simon with another episode of Future Talks with futurists Glenn Himstra and Gerd Leonhard. And today we're going to explore the long tail. Gerd, what is the long tail?
Well, the original thought of the long tail was put forth by Chris Anderson at Wired magazine.
He's the editor-in-chief of Wired, right?
Yes, and he's of course the author of the book called The Long Tail, which I highly recommend.
Right.
And basically, the long tail idea is to say that in a digital ecosystem, it's possible that all the hits are stay on top when the misses, so to speak, the lesser known articles, they are essentially in the back part of the e-commerce system. They can be as valuable as the hits.
So does that mean in an age where there is no limitation on the kinds or the volume of material or product you have, that even those items that move very, very slowly during the course of a year or 2 or 3 years, that is the bottom of the tail?
Yeah.
Whereas the big sellers, the big hits, that's the top of the tail.
Yeah, in the aggregate, all of the non-hits can be as big as the hits. That's the central theory of his book. And when he published it, he put forth Amazon as an example back then as selling 45% of the revenues coming from unknown books, which has actually been adjusted by Amazon and by other sources to be about, I think, 24%. So that number really wasn't quite correct. But the idea is essentially saying that there is lots of money to be made with the unknown, right, which includes music, motion pictures, films, television, all that stuff, digital art that can be put forth in a digital system. So the difference being is that in a real life system, you can't distribute a TV show to 30 million people if it's not a fit for 30 million people. Right? So he has a lot of great examples in there, and I think the general theory is correct, and I think we're seeing that everywhere now, including iTunes and other services. It's a little bit it's a phenomenon that's part of other phenomena, in digital entertainment. And so as such, it stands alone a little bit too exposed, for my feeling, to make sense, if you just keep on hammering on it. But in general, I think there's lots and lots of miles in the idea of creating businesses based on the long tail.
So this means that, for example, Walmart, which is the largest seller of home entertainment in the United States, carry probably 2,000 to 4,000 titles of DVDs and music combined. In the long tail, this is carrying everything that might ever have been recorded.
That would be it. And the concept, obviously the long tail could virtually not exist prior to the digital world, obviously. I mean, people could make something, and certainly people did self-publish books, or they made a demo tape and so on, and that was that, and nobody ever heard of it. Now at least you have a chance to get some notice. The challenge, I think, to me, about the long tail is the concept as understood, at least on the surface, is, there's lots of money to be made in the long tail. And in the aggregate, you add it all up, it probably does add up to quite a bit. But my question is it any different really for the individual creator, individual artist, in that if I'm in the long tail and I do, let's say I write a book and it sells 2,000 copies, which puts me in the long tail, have I really made a living? Will I ever really do that again? Now in the aggregate, it adds up to a whole bunch, but for me, maybe it's the only time I'll ever try it. So I'm wondering if the long tail, there are two ways of looking at it. One is, will the long tail have to have so much churn in order to keep existing so that everybody keeps trying at least once? Or will the expansion of the digital world to the whole planet, because of all the technology stuff that's going on, mean that the long tail, in a sense, doesn't get longer, it gets fatter? So that even though I'm way down the long tail, I still have access to 1 million potential readers or listeners, and I'm never going to be up here at 10 million, but I do have a shot down here that obviously I wouldn't have had before.
I think it's in many cases, it's a word like Web 2.0, which a lot of people are wondering, what in the world does that mean? It's like, can I make a Web 3.0, 4.0? If I'm the king, if I make a 10.0, it's like some sort of software release or like a gas rating, octane rating. So the thing about the long tail is that in a large degree, it's describing something that is much more complex than that one word, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the wake of his book, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of proposals to venture capitalists about long tail companies. Right?
And that was the whole idea. Right. It really wasn't so much, this is a really cool thing because it means this artist can make some money. It's that, you can create a company, and if you aggregate a whole bunch of people who aren't making money you can still make money off of them. Is that
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, this is like
Is that right?
mp3.com, right? You're saying, okay, here we got 750,000 artists, you know, for back in those days, who to a large degree have described themselves as musical landfill, which is kind of crude to them, but it probably wasn't the case. But, you know, you have all these people who are essentially nobodies to some degree, right? Can they make money in the aggregate? Well, with mp3.com, it didn't really work, but CD Baby, for example, does, right? But there's different reasons for different things. So, can CD Baby call themselves a long-tail company? Maybe they can, maybe they should, but it's a bit of an artificial sort of focus that wouldn't necessarily merit, you know, just keeping it like this. Just like Web 2.0 is sort of a stamp, you know, that everybody wants to have that stamp, but, you know, in itself it doesn't define everything I do or somebody.
So this means, in essence, that the long tail would apply to the digital distribution of content in a world where you need no storage other than digital storage. You need no packaging because there's no need for packaging. You need no motor vehicles taking the product from store to store, from wholesaler to store. And so in essence, you have an infinite quantity of content that is in the tail. And the question then is, how does something from the bottom end of the tail work its way up through the spinal column of the tail?
I think that what's happening is that within 10 years, we'll see various pieces of the tail sort of being taken out and creating their own hit or head outside of a certain tail, in parentheses. So what you create your own beast essentially by going outside of the long tail and becoming, you know, everybody wants to be on the top of the heap, whether they're a blogger or a musician, or that doesn't mean I would necessarily be the host on CNN, but I could still be very successful as a blogger, like many people already are at Engadget or Boing Boing. They're sort of like CNN, you know, a different version of it in a way. So I think what's happening in 10 years is that we'll see a lot of stuff that used to be completely unknown somewhere down there have their own life in different forms coming out of this in the terms of, the term long tail, I think, wraps it up as a good sort of description. Again, like the world is flat wraps up globalization as a good description. But you can't always say the world is flat, and that's why.
One question that I've had for a while about the long tail, and you both probably have opinions on this, is can you, as a business proposition, kind of lop off some people at the end of the long tail and turn that into a business? For the people in that group, there probably isn't much money, but as an aggregate, maybe there is. But can you do that and not have something at the head? Or do you have to start with the head and let a long tail build?
Well, my experience has been, at least in music and to a certain degree in television, other areas, is that you really can't do that, because this would amount to saying you want a dog, but you only want the tail. You know, I think as a blogger, for example, you can make your own dog, right? So you're both the head and the tail, you know, as a blogger. And therefore, that's a little bit different. You know, blogging world, to a large degree, is all in the tail. But some of the blogs have more traffic than CNN or than Reuters, right? Mm-hmm. There are some. So at that point, you become both the head and the tail. You know, so this distinction is a little bit, as I said before, artificial to some reality reasons. But in general, I don't think you can just say, well, I'm a long tail company, I just take all the unknown. This would be like Amazon saying, well, we don't care about doing deals with Simon & Schuster. All we do is all the self-published stuff, right? Amazon would never work that way. In fact, Amazon sells a lot of the long tail because it sells so much of the top that attracts everyone to come fishing. Mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm, and unfortunately, in the music industry, it's still very much the same thing. I mean, you can clearly see if you don't have the hit repertoire, you know, on internet radio or whatever, you know, e-music, great case, right? They can call themselves a long tail company, and they've been quite successful at that too. But in overall proportions, they suffer badly from not having the head.
So it really looks as though the long tail, this phenomenon, has really had an impact. And so as a closing note, it's quite clear to see every dog has his day, but those without a tail have a weekend.